Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. During my time as a volunteer at an airport several years ago, in a central region of Colorado. I prefer not to mention the name of the county for reasons that will soon become clear. I went through an experience that I feel I must share. Near the end of my time there, I already knew many people from different areas. I had a good relationship with almost everyone. Despite the occasional jokes, everything was very professional. Until one Tuesday morning, one of those really quiet ones during the off-season, something happened. It was early, around 6 in the morning, and the airport was practically empty. There were only a few people waiting for their flights, and few colleagues already at work, all still waking up with the help of coffee. As I was heading to the office, passing through the waiting areas, I heard a baby crying near the restrooms. But that sound was strange. The baby seemed to be in despair, as if something was wrong, but at the same time, the sound came muffled, distant, as if it echoed from behind several walls. It was intriguing, because there shouldn't have been anything in the area beyond the bathroom. I paused for a moment, trying to understand. I thought that perhaps it was a mother in the women's restroom, changing her child's diaper. However, the sound continued to be strange. It seemed like someone was stifling the cry, maybe with a fabric, as if they wanted to prevent others from hearing. I decided to approach, concerned, and open the door. As soon as I entered, silence took over the place. I looked around. All the stall doors were open, and the bathroom was empty. Even so, I asked if there was anyone there, perhaps needing help or toilet paper. Nothing. I went from stall to stall, but I didn't find a soul. However, the way the crying ceased at the exact moment I opened the door was disturbing. I left there with goosebumps, troubled by what had happened, and went straight to my office. I told what happened to a more experienced colleague, with whom I had more intimacy. He was always serious, not the type to make tasteless jokes. He looked at me and said, "That scared you, didn't it?" Well, something like this happened here many years ago. I wasn't working at the airport at the time, but I heard the stories. When I started, a lady named Margaret warned me. If you hear a baby crying desperately in the bathrooms, don't go alone. Call someone. Ask for help, but never enter alone. He paused, looked at me seriously, and completed, "Let me tell you why, but come with me because there are people here who don't like this kind of thing being discussed, especially that gentleman over there." He was referring to a strict supervisor, someone who censored us for any slip-up. We went to my colleague's office, where he continued the story. It was Margaret who told me. That year there was intense but very discreet activity because one afternoon, in the women's bathroom, they found something terrible in the trash can. He paused again. I hope you don't mind because it's a heavy story. And I say this with the utmost respect. It was a baby, you understand. A baby that hadn't been fully born yet, but was already at an advanced stage. I prefer not to describe the details. They turned everything upside down, looking for suspects on the cameras. But you know, with so many people passing through the bathrooms of an airport, it's almost impossible. However, they discovered that the person boarded a flight near that area. And honestly, to this day, no one knows for sure if she was identified. You can ask around, but few will admit that something like this happened. In fact, some say that hearing a baby crying in that bathroom is just a legend. That's because when the investigations happened, they instructed us to deny everything. They didn't want the airport to be associated with such a tragic situation, even though they weren't directly responsible. My colleague sighed, visibly touched. It's very sad to remember this. It puts a knot in my throat, but at the same time, I confess it scares me to know that there's a reason for that crying you heard right there. It's something that affects us. He continued, they said they did everything you know. Vigils, prayers, pleading for this little one. It wasn't uncommon for some people to hear it, but the phenomenon diminished over time. Nowadays, it's less common for someone to report this, but it still happens. He pondered for a moment and added, maybe it's necessary for them to find who left the baby there so that it can rest in peace. But you know what? I've heard people say that children, due to certain beliefs, don't have to wander around here after they're gone. So deep down, I don't know what to think. I can only guarantee you're not crazy. I've also heard about this crying, and I believe it's real. 2 weeks passed without incident. I had started to put the experience behind me, attributing it to the power of suggestion after hearing my colleague's story. But on the last Thursday of October, around 5:30 in the morning, I was assigned to check the bathroom supplies before the morning rush began. I entered the same women's restroom, pushing a cart loaded with paper towels and toilet paper. The airport was especially quiet that morning. A heavy snowstorm had delayed most incoming flights, and the departure hall was nearly deserted. As I restocked the paper towel dispenser, I heard it again, the desperate, muffled crying of an infant. This time, it seemed to be coming from the last stall. I froze, paper towels still in my hands, as the crying grew louder, more distressed. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing against the tile walls. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The crying stopped abruptly. Then, to my horror, it started again. But this time it sounded like it was right beside me, though I was completely alone in the restroom. I abandoned my cart and backed toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The crying seemed to follow me, circling around like it was emanating from multiple points in the room simultaneously. Then something caught my eye, a shadow moving along the floor, small and shapeless, sliding beneath the stall partitions. I fumbled for the door handle behind me, desperate to escape, when suddenly the lights flickered. In that split second of darkness, I felt something brush against my ankle, something cold and impossibly small. When I finally pushed through the door into the hallway, nearly collapsing with relief, I found myself face to face with Margaret, the woman my colleague had mentioned. She was in her 70s now, still working part-time at the information desk. One look at my face told her everything. "You heard it," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. "And it touched you, didn't it?" Her eyes narrowed with concern. "The little one never touches anyone." That evening, Margaret invited me to her home just outside the airport grounds. It was a modest place, filled with airport memorabilia from her decades of service. In her kitchen, she made tea and finally told me the complete story. "It was 1986, she began. "I was working the late shift when a young woman came through. couldn't have been more than 19, terrified, clutching her stomach. She asked me where the restrooms were. I didn't think much of it. People get airsick all the time. But something in her eyes haunted me. About an hour later, I went to check on her. The bathroom was empty, but there was blood on the floor of the last stall. Margaret paused, her hands trembling slightly around her teacup. I called security immediately. They found the remains in the trash can. The girl had already boarded her flight to Chicago. By the time authorities there were alerted, she disappeared into the city. Did they ever find her? I asked. No, Margaret said. But that's not the end of the story. 3 weeks later, I was cleaning that same bathroom when I heard a woman sobbing. I thought someone was in distress, so I checked each stall. Empty, but the sobbing continued. Then I heard her voice clearly. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I felt a chill run down my spine. The mother came back. Not physically, Margaret said quietly. But her spirit did, and it still does. The baby cries, and the mother returns to apologize. An endless cycle of regret and longing. Sometimes years pass between occurrences, but it always happens when someone who can sense these things is present. Like me, I whispered. Margaret nodded. Like you. And one more thing, the fact that it touched you. That's never happened before. The baby's spirit is becoming stronger, more desperate. It's reaching out for what? I don't know, she admitted. Maybe recognition. Maybe justice. Or maybe just to be heard, finally, after all these years. I left my volunteer position at the airport the following week, using a job offer in Denver as an excuse. I couldn't bear the thought of walking past those restrooms again. But before I left, I placed a small white rose in a vase on the counter near the women's bathroom. A tiny memorial that no one else would understand. Years later, I read in the local paper that during renovations, construction workers had discovered a small box buried in the wall of that bathroom. Inside was a handwritten note and a tiny silver bracelet. The article didn't reveal what the note said, only that airport authorities had arranged for a proper burial and memorial service. The crying, they say, has never been heard again. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Not all stories begin with an obvious mystery. Sometimes, it's a simple question that triggers events that no one could predict. What would you do if an apparently harmless belief transformed into something that shook the very reality of who you are? My name is Cecilia Morris, and I work as a nurse in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. But what I'm about to tell you happened many years ago, when I was just 21 years old. Back then, I was helping a friend of my mother's as an apprentice. She was responsible for organizing home visits, and my task was to assist with simple things. I didn't directly deal with patients, but tried to be present to offer some kind of support. My mother worked at a small health center, where she also conducted campaigns to collect materials for community outreach. On one such occasion, we used resources provided by this center for a visit to a Native American community. We stayed for a week in a safe house, something that fortunately never caused us problems. We went as a group, my mother, her friend, two companions who were older gentlemen with genuine kindness, and myself. We performed many tasks, most related to our work, but what really left a mark was the case of a young boy. He had stepped barefoot on a piece of glass, and the wound on his foot was severely infected. We did what was possible in that situation, trying to offer the maximum care. It was near a small plot of land, where trucks used for mixing cement were parked. At least that's what I think. Those who know the area might identify the place. Next to us were the houses. That day the treatment was for a young boy, and was done by me and an elderly lady. Nothing too complicated. It was just a matter of him recovering. What always caught my attention was the boy's grandfather, a man who, despite being in his 30s, seemed robust and healthy. He treated us incredibly well and showed evident care for his grandson. He and his wife had the habit of offering us coffee when we appeared there, and even sheltered us for 2 days while we took care of another case. When we finished monitoring his grandson, he told us where we could find them if we needed to. As we were walking out on that dirt road, the grandfather caught up with us alone. I remember exactly what he said to us. "Ladies, thank you very much for taking care of my grandson, and excuse me. I know you're always busy, but I wanted to ask a question. I heard that putting dog discharge in your eyes can make you sick. Is that true?" We confirmed that yes, it was dangerous and groundless, and asked why he wanted to know. He then revealed, "Well, it makes sense. Just don't tell my wife. A few days ago, before you arrived, I was desperately seeking help for my grandson's foot from an elder woman. She said you would come, and it was better to wait for you." During the conversation, we ended up talking about the apparition stories that our parents used to tell around here. I asked her about this dog discharge thing because from what I know, many people believe it helps you see ghosts. And of course, whoever does this ends up getting sick. But at that moment, out of impulse, or I don't know what, I believed it. I took some discharge from our dog's eyes and put it in my own at night. It was just for seconds, then I quickly washed my eyes. It's been a few days, and so far I'm fine. We told him to keep an eye on it, even if everything seemed normal. We took out a small flashlight and examined his eyes right there, but we didn't see anything concerning. Still, we asked him to come see us the next day. He thanked us and went back home, but the following day, it was his wife who came. She approached us speaking softly, with an air of concern. She wanted to tell us something, and what she said was so unusual that it's one of those stories you only believe because you're face to face with who's telling it. You can see how the person reacts and sense the seriousness of it. Otherwise, you would think it was all made up. She told us that for a few days, during the night, something had been bothering them. It was as if someone was knocking on their bedroom window. Both she and her husband would get up to check, but they never saw anyone. Still, their experience seemed quite different. While she was merely intrigued, he went through moments of absolute panic. He claimed to see a headless woman outside, saying she had come for him. He would become completely beside himself, nervous, and she was thankful that her grandson, perhaps exhausted from his illness, never woke up to the screams. These crises repeated for several nights. She tried to calm him, insisting that it made no sense, that there was no one there. Even so, he seemed terrified, to the point of putting on his shoes and running out of the house in the middle of the night, saying that the headless woman wanted him to follow her. As much as she tried to stop him, she never succeeded. He would return in the morning, exhausted, with no memory of what had happened, only knowing that he would dawn at some point on the nearby hill. But on the following nights, the cycle would restart. Noises at the window, the same desperation, the same runs. One night, he mentioned something even stranger. He said the headless woman had promised to reveal where certain things were buried. The next morning, however, he didn't return. It was already 11 o'clock, and there was no sign of him when his wife came looking for us. All we could say was what he had told us about the dog's discharge. Despite not seeing a direct connection between the things, we asked if she had noticed any problem with her husband's eyes, but she said no. However, upon hearing this, she looked visibly different, as if something had crossed her mind. Determined, she said she would seek help among the residents to try to find her husband. They planned to ask if anyone had seen him, and if necessary, organize a search on the hill. The only clue was that he used to mention that place, but he never said exactly where he went. In the days that followed, she stopped by to update us. He still hadn't returned. Before we finished our work in the community, she made a comment that caught our attention. She said that since the episode with the dog's discharge, her husband had changed. He wasn't himself anymore. His behavior, especially the visions of the woman, made no sense to her. We left, leaving the search in the hands of the neighbors, who continued trying to understand where he could be or what he saw. A month later, colleagues who visited the same community told us something disturbing. The man was never found. During the searches, they ended up finding several pieces of women's clothing abandoned on the hill. There was no indication of whose they were or how they had ended up there, nor whether they were linked to the man's disappearance. In the end, we were left with unanswered questions. What really happened to him? What could he have seen? That was over 15 years ago, but the memory of this case has never faded. Last year, I returned to that same community for a medical outreach program. The houses had been renovated, and many new families had moved in. I was checking a patient's blood pressure in one of the homes when I noticed a familiar face in a framed photo on the wall. The missing man's wife, now visibly aged. After finishing with my patient, I asked about the woman in the photo. "That's my grandmother," the young man told me. "She passed last winter." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said sincerely. "I met her years ago." Her husband? I hesitated, unsure if I should mention the strange disappearance. "Grandfather. He disappeared before I was born," he said matter-of-factly. "There's a strange story about that." "Want to hear it?" I nodded, my heartbeat quickening. About 5 years ago, some construction workers were excavating for a new housing development on the hill. They found a burial site that hadn't been documented, ancient remains, the archaeologists said, maybe hundreds of years old. Among them was a female skeleton, separated from the others. He lowered his voice. The strange thing is, they never found her skull. And around the grave, they discovered men's clothing from the 90s, including my grandfather's hat, the one he was wearing the night he disappeared. "Did they ever figure out what happened to him?" I asked. "No, but my grandmother had a theory. She believed he somehow found his way to the ancient burial ground that night and disturbed something that should have remained at rest. She said the headless woman finally got what she wanted, someone to help her find her missing head. And did they ever find it? The head, he shook his head. No, but every now and then, especially on moonless nights, people walking on that hill claim to see a man and a woman walking together. He leads the way, holding a lantern, and she follows, still searching. I left Pine Ridge the next day, cutting my volunteer assignment short. Setting aside the danger of using dog discharge in one's eyes, I've often wondered, what did that man really see? What compelled him to follow a vision into the night? And most unsettling of all, what if he's still searching, even now? Shortly after settling into a small house on the outskirts of town, I began to notice how the place seemed more remote than it really was. Although it was only 20 minutes from my previous address, the environment gave a sensation of total isolation. The property was surrounded by trees, which completely blocked the view of other houses or even nearby roads, creating an atmosphere of absolute peace. But that changed on the very first day. While I was organizing things, I heard a knock on the door at dusk. On the other side was a middle-aged man with long graying hair and deep-set eyes. He greeted me politely, but there was something disconcerting about his presence. He tried to make trivial conversation, but his posture was rigid and his face remained serious, almost expressionless. The interaction was uncomfortable, but I didn't pay much attention. I thought it might just be a curious neighbor. However, the next day, while I was still unpacking the same boxes from the day before, he knocked again. His behavior was also identical. He spoke vaguely, as if he had no real reason to be there. It seemed like he was prolonging the conversation just for the sake of being there, without purpose. After a few uncomfortable minutes, I ended the conversation politely, but firmly, and went back to what I was doing. I was starting to feel uneasy. Later, another knock on the door caught my attention. This time, the sound was firm and insistent, very different from the previous visits. As I peeked through the hallway, I noticed his shadow through the curtains. My tone was direct, almost impatient. Please go away. I have a lot to do right now. Still, he remained standing there. After a few seconds, he insisted with another, louder knock. Irritated, I went to the door determined to resolve this once and for all. When I opened it, he was much closer than before, less than a foot away from me. His eyes were vacant, and his rigid posture seemed to carry a frightening tension. It was then that I noticed something that chilled me, a knife partially hidden under the sleeve of his jacket. I slammed the door with all my strength before he could react, quickly locking it while he continued knocking violently. He didn't say another word, just kept insisting as if possessed by some dark impulse. I called the police and checked every lock in the house, trying to stay calm. He remained there for a few minutes before finally leaving. The police arrived too late. I described the man and explained what had happened, believing he was some neighbor. To my surprise, none of the nearby houses had residents matching the description. Not even the neighbors claimed to have seen anyone like that in the area. To this day, I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or why he was armed. I hope he has disappeared forever. The incident left me shaken. And for the next few weeks, I kept all the blinds drawn and triple-checked the locks before going to bed. I even invested in a simple security system, just motion sensor lights and a camera for the front door. Nothing fancy, but it gave me some peace of mind. 3 weeks passed without incident. I was starting to feel safe again, convincing myself it had been a random encounter with someone who had moved on. Then came that Wednesday night in late autumn. I had fallen asleep on the couch, watching an old movie. It must have been around midnight when a sharp noise from the kitchen jolted me awake. It sounded like silverware being knocked to the floor. Still groggy, I sat up and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer came, but I could hear soft footsteps moving across the kitchen tile. I reached for my phone, ready to call the police again, when the motion light outside suddenly illuminated. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keypad. The footsteps inside stopped too. Whoever was in my kitchen was now standing completely still. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement. The digital clock on the cable box cast a pale blue glow. The only light in the room besides the outdoor floodlight streaming through the kitchen window. In that dim illumination, I could make out a silhouette standing in the kitchen doorway. It was him. The same vacant eyes stared at me from across the room. He was wearing the same clothes as before, but now his hands were empty, hanging at his sides. He didn't move toward me or speak. He just stood there, watching. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice breaking with fear. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost childlike, nothing like what I had expected. "You're living in my house," he said simply. A cold realization washed over me. This isn't your house," I stammered. "I bought it fair and square 3 months ago." He shook his head slowly. "No, this has always been my house. Since 1963. The house had been built in the 1970s. I knew this from the property records." "That's impossible," I said. "This house didn't exist then." A sad smile crossed his face. "Not the house. The land. My family's land. They took it from us to build these houses. Said it was for the public good. Eminent domain, they called it." He took a step forward and I tensed, but there was no aggression in his movement. "I come back sometimes," he continued, "to remember. Usually no one sees me. But you see me, are you?" I couldn't finish the question. It seemed absurd. "Dead?" he laughed softly. "No, just lost. Lost in time, maybe. Lost in anger. I don't know anymore." He glanced toward the kitchen window. "They're coming for me again. They always do." In the distance, I could hear sirens. My security system must have automatically called the police when the motion sensor was triggered. "I'll be back," he said, moving toward the back door. "This land remembers us, even if no one else does." By the time the police arrived, he was gone. They found no evidence of a break-in, no fingerprints, not even footprints in the soft earth outside my back door. The officer suggested I might have been dreaming, that the stress from the previous encounter had triggered a vivid nightmare. I sold the house 2 weeks later, taking a significant loss. The new owners, a young couple with a baby on the way, seemed excited about their purchase. I considered warning them, but decided against it. What would I say? As I drove away for the last time, I glanced in my rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the property, partially hidden by trees, watching me leave. When I blinked, he was gone. Sometimes I wonder if he's still there, visiting what he considers his rightful home. And sometimes, on sleepless nights, I wonder if I ever really left. A few years ago, some friends and I heard through a mutual acquaintance about an abandoned furniture store or warehouse located just a few miles from my house. The place had a reputation for being frightening, and one ordinary night during an evening drive, we decided to investigate. We parked the car at a CVS several hundred yards away and proceeded on foot toward the location. As we approached, one of my friends, let's call him Alex, began to feel uncomfortable and decided not to continue, staying behind. Only Dylan and I pressed on. When we reached the side of the building, it became evident that the place had been unoccupied for a long time. The main entrance was boarded up, and climbing vines dominated the structure. According to what we'd been told, the only entrance was through a gap in the wall at the back. We went around, and there it was, a narrow opening resulting from a broken piece of the wall. We squeezed through it, and upon entering, we were confronted with total darkness. We couldn't see anything, not even our hands in front of our faces. We had to turn on our cell phone flashlights to explore the environment. The concrete floor was covered with debris and trash remains. Apparently, we were in the main hall of the former establishment. It was an immense space, large enough to house a football field, and our voices echoed in a frightening way. We decided to examine the walls, which were covered with graffiti. Many were typical gang scribbles and curses that didn't surprise anyone. However, as we approached the back of the building, the messages and drawings became more disturbing. In one of the inscriptions, someone had written, "Take your own life today." Soon after, the graffiti began to adopt a macabre and satanic tone, with inverted crosses, pentagrams, the number 666, as well as representations of violent scenes. But as bad as what we had seen so far was, the most frightening discoveries were yet to come. Near the end of the building, we found some steps leading to smaller rooms. When we pointed our flashlights at the steps, we saw a large dried stain that looked like blood. This was enough to discourage us from going any further, so we decided to return to the opposite side of the main hall. As we walked, our light beams caught something hanging from the ceiling. We approached and saw that it was a noose, still swinging from a beam. It became clear that people who visited that place had dark and disturbing intentions. After that, we concluded that we had already stayed inside for too long and returned to the opening through which we had entered. Outside, we spotted another smaller building, positioned behind the main one. Despite everything we had witnessed, curiosity led us to explore this second location. Something particularly strange caught our attention. A small room at the front of the building without doors, just a window. Inside, hanging from the deteriorated ceiling, was an inverted cross of considerable size. We went to the side of the building, where there was a wide entrance in the style of garage doors. The interior was similar to the first warehouse, a large empty area full of trash. However, here the graffiti was even more disturbing. There were also holes in the base of the walls that seemed very strange to us. When we illuminated the holes with our flashlights, we couldn't see the bottom. We had no idea what they were for. That was enough to end our exploration. We left the place convinced that it harbored darker secrets than we could imagine. It was at that moment that Dylan answered a call from Alex. As they talked, Dylan's face changed drastically, assuming an expression of pure terror. "What happened?" I asked, feeling a chill run up my spine. The answer was enough to leave me completely alarmed. "We're not alone here." Before we could even react, a white van appeared at the corner, accelerating in our direction at a frightening speed. Without hesitation, we started running as fast as possible toward my car. However, as we turned around the other side of the building, we came face to face with another van, this time black, parked on the side. Even so, we continued running without looking back, determined to reach the car. Luckily, we made it to the vehicle, got in, and quickly drove away. To this day, I don't know what those people in the vans were doing or why they decided to chase us. But I'm certain that nothing good was happening in that place. And honestly, I prefer not to know. We never went back there, and I hope we never have to. The story might have ended there, but about 6 months later, a local news story caught my attention. The headline read, "Human remains found in abandoned warehouse." It was our warehouse. According to the report, a homeless man seeking shelter had discovered a sealed room containing what appeared to be a makeshift altar and human bones. The police estimated the remains belonged to at least 3 different individuals. The article mentioned that the building had once been a successful furniture store in the 60s and 70s before the owner, a man named Raymond Keller, disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1979. His business partner took over, but eventually closed the store in 1984 after claiming to hear voices and footsteps at night. The property had changed hands multiple times since then, but no one had successfully developed it. Local rumors suggested it was cursed. What struck me most was the description of the smaller building behind the main warehouse. According to the article, it had once been Keller's private workshop where he crafted custom furniture pieces. The holes in the walls that we had found so puzzling. They weren't holes at all. They were access points to hidden chambers beneath the floor. The article didn't go into detail about what had been found in those chambers, only that the investigation was ongoing. I called Dylan immediately after reading the story. "Did you see the news?" I asked when he picked up. There was a long pause before he responded. "Yeah, but there's something they didn't mention in the article. Something I never told you about that night." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Remember when I got that call from Alex? He wasn't just telling us to get out of there. He told me he saw people watching us from inside the main building, people wearing what looked like ceremonial robes. He thought they were just homeless at first, but then he noticed they were all standing perfectly still, facing our direction." "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I demanded. "Because I didn't want to believe it," Dylan replied, his voice trembling slightly. "And there's one more thing. When we were looking at those holes in the wall, I lied about not seeing anything inside. I did see something just for a second when I pointed my light down there." "What was it?" I whispered, not sure I wanted to know. "Eyes," he said. "Dozens of eyes, blinking up at me from the darkness. And they weren't animal eyes, man. They were human. I've never returned to that part of town, not even to drive past. The local paper eventually reported that the warehouse was to be demolished as part of a new development project. Whether that actually happened, I don't know. Some things are better left uninvestigated, some doors better left unopened, and some buildings better left to their secrets. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about those holes in the wall. And I wonder if, somewhere in my city, those eyes are still watching, waiting for the next curious visitors to wander too close to the darkness. I'll try to be brief, because what I experienced is complex and difficult to explain. More than 20 years ago, I worked on a flight for an airline that operated private flights based in Lake Tahoe, Nevada. That day, I was responsible for a small plane with few passengers, which was typical since this type of transport is usually used by business people or important figures. However, on that specific day, there were only 6 men and 4 women on board, all adults. The flight was proceeding normally. We provided the service as usual until my coworker came to the cabin where I was. He closed the door behind him and, with a low voice, asked me to accompany him to the back of the plane. As we walked, I heard a woman screaming, disturbing, intense screams. When we got closer, I realized we had no way to communicate with the captain or with the other crew members. At the passenger's request, the plane had a reduced crew. Besides the 2 of us, there was only 1 more person working, and the captain. In private flights, it's common for passengers to dictate certain conditions, depending on who they are. I asked in a controlled tone what was happening, concerned that there might be some kind of threat or danger on board. My colleague was visibly shaken, sweating, with a red face, opening his uniform collar and trying to calm himself with quick gulps of water. He finally responded, asking me to speak softly. "We're not in danger, but you need to stay quiet." This only increased my uneasiness. I continued insisting, trying to understand why he said there was no risk, but was clearly terrified. He, however, seemed reluctant to give me any details. After a few minutes of tension, he turned to me and with an almost panicked expression whispered, "What you're hearing is an exorcism." I didn't know how to react. I wanted to doubt it, but the expression on his face was impossible to ignore. He was so shaken that he continued trembling, sweating, and drinking water, as if desperately trying to stay on his feet. With a trembling voice, he added, "I saw the woman on the floor. Her face looked like that of a black man, but she's a white woman." She was saying strange things and screaming in that feminine voice, but with her face completely altered. My colleague began to cry, hiding his face in a towel to dry the sweat and prevent the passengers from noticing. I, on the other hand, felt paralyzed. I couldn't process what he was saying. I asked, almost without knowing why, if he was sure of what he had seen. He just repeated that we should remain silent and pray that no one would call us for anything. The rest of the flight was surreal. At some point, the plane began to descend, and the noise coming from the passenger cabin ceased. We followed our tasks normally, giving instructions over the sound system, but avoiding entering that area or mentioning what had happened to the captain. Everything ended in an uncomfortable silence. But to this day, the memory of that day remains as clear as if it had happened yesterday. When I went out to open the doors and carry out the disembarkation procedure. I was surprised by the calm that everyone displayed, as if absolutely nothing had occurred. They were accompanying a woman whose face was covered with towels, holding her by the shoulders as she walked calmly. It was impossible not to feel that this was part of a disconcerting experience, something that completely takes you out of reality and leaves you without direction. Shortly afterward, the captain left the cockpit and found us. His countenance was grave, and he said only, "What you saw, keep to yourselves. I recommend you undergo a spiritual cleansing. May God bless this plane because what happened here was very heavy." My colleague and I were perplexed. Upon returning to Lake Tahoe, already without the passengers whom we had left in Idaho, we waited for his family to pick him up. We didn't comment on the incident during the return trip. We had the company of 2 work colleagues, and never again found ourselves in a situation like that. Nor did we fly again with those people or on that plane. Even after so much time, what I experienced on that flight is still very clear to me. Still, it's difficult to process when you witness something so surreal. The words of my colleague and the seriousness of the captain made everything seem like something out of a movie, but it was reality. That left a deep mark on me. Yes, I was on board a plane where an exorcism happened, and all of this thousands of feet in the air. But there's more to the story, details I've never told anyone until now. As the flight continued after the incident, I found myself drawn back toward the passenger cabin, not out of morbid curiosity, but because something was calling me there. It was an inexplicable pull, like a voice only I could hear, urging me to return. Against my better judgment and my colleagues' warnings, I made an excuse about needing to check the emergency equipment and slipped back toward where the passengers were seated. The curtain that separated the cabin areas was partially closed, but I could see through a small gap. What I witnessed will forever be etched in my memory. The woman slowly turned her head toward me. Her movements were fluid, almost too perfect, like someone who had just learned how to inhabit a human body. When our eyes met, I felt a jolt of electricity run through me, as if some current had passed between us. Her eyes were mismatched, one blue, one brown, though I distinctly remembered noting earlier in the flight that both her eyes had been blue. She smiled at me, a smile that was both gentle and terrifying in its perfection. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow I heard it clearly over the drone of the airplane engines. "Thank you for witnessing," she said. "Someone always must." I backed away, nearly stumbling over my own feet, and returned to the galley where my colleague waited. He looked at me knowingly, but asked no questions. We completed the remainder of the flight in silence. When we landed in Idaho and the passengers were disembarking, the woman paused at the door where I stood. The towels were back around her face, but she had removed them just enough to reveal her eyes, now both blue again. She reached out and touched my hand briefly. "The transition is always difficult," she said softly, "but necessary. The vessel survives, and so does the essence." Before I could respond, she was guided away by her companions. As they walked across the tarmac to a waiting black SUV, I noticed something peculiar about their footprints in the light dusting of snow that had fallen. While the men left normal impressions, the woman's footprints seemed to change with each step, sometimes deeper, sometimes lighter, sometimes with a different gait pattern altogether, as if multiple people were taking turns walking in her shoes. The captain's words to us after the flight now made more sense. This wasn't just an exorcism in the traditional sense. It was something older, something beyond the frameworks of conventional religion or modern understanding. 3 days after that flight, I received a small package at my apartment. Inside was a beautiful antique silver pendant with intricate symbols I didn't recognize, and a note that read simply, "For protection. Some memories attract attention from both sides of the veil." I've worn that pendant every day since. I've never experienced anything like that flight again. But sometimes, when I'm at cruising altitude on a commercial flight, looking out at the endless sky, I feel a familiar presence, that same ancient knowledge I saw in the man's eyes. And I understand now why certain rituals are performed at 37,000 feet, in the liminal space between heaven and earth, where the boundaries between worlds grow thin. I left the airline industry 2 years later, but not because of that experience. In fact, it gave me a strange sort of peace, an understanding that there are deeper currents running beneath the surface of our reality. I still fly as a passenger, and occasionally I'll spot someone in an airport or on a plane who has that same ancient look in their eyes. We never speak, just exchange knowing nods, like members of a secret club bound by witnessed impossibilities. Whether what I saw was truly an exorcism, a possession, or something else entirely, some ritual from traditions far older than our recorded history, I may never know. But I've made my peace with that uncertainty, and with the knowledge that at any moment, even miles above the earth, surrounded by the trappings of modern technology, the thin veil that separates our world from others can momentarily part. Was sitting upright now, the towels removed from her face. She looked perfectly normal, even serene. The men around her were speaking in hushed tones, but not in English or any language I could recognize. It was a strange, rhythmic cadence that seemed to flow like water. One of the men noticed me watching and made eye contact. His eyes, I'll never forget them, weren't angry or threatening. They were ancient somehow, filled with a knowledge that seemed impossible for any human to possess. He didn't speak or motion for me to leave. He simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging my presence was permitted. The woman. Certain stories make us question what is superstition and what might be something deeper. Imagine arriving at work and facing a mystery that not only challenges your logic, but also leaves a trail of uneasiness throughout the office. This is one of those stories where an apparently ordinary detail transforms into an omen. I want to share something that happened in my workplace. For obvious reasons, I won't mention my name or personal details. It all started in the second week of my new job, when an apparently trivial event took unexpected proportions. I hold a good position, but for various reasons, things have taken a strange turn. I work for a company specializing in pharmaceutical distribution. I know the sector doesn't have the best reputation, but unlike many others, this organization opens doors for recent graduates like me. I've been here for only a month and felt very comfortable until the episode I'm about to narrate, which occurred in my second week. That day, I arrived a bit later than usual because I had an appointment with a client in the early morning hours. It was around 8 in the morning when I entered the office, which operates in a spacious, adapted house in the historic district of Boston. As soon as I arrived, I saw that a colleague from the payroll department and my supervisor were visibly agitated, talking at the reception desk around one of the secretaries who worked directly for the boss. The secretary was seated but clearly disturbed, crying uncontrollably. As soon as my supervisor saw me, she discreetly signaled for me to go straight through without stopping. I did so, although it was almost impossible to ignore the scene. Later, when everything seemed to have calmed down a bit, my boss returned to the office without mentioning what had happened. Neither my colleague, who is also a recruiter, nor I asked any questions until shortly before the end of the workday. She told us that the secretary had gone through a personal problem and that we should avoid getting involved. We accepted without questioning, especially since I never liked getting mixed up in workplace gossip. However, the next day, I noticed the incident hadn't ended there. Some colleagues spent the entire day commenting on what had happened, and the receptionist didn't show up for work. What caught my attention most was hearing insinuations that something serious had happened within the company itself. I began to suspect that my boss hadn't told us the whole truth. Paying more attention to the conversations, there were mentions of beetles. Not that I wanted to get involved, but it's hard to escape rumors in a workplace. In the afternoon, after returning from lunch, I found my colleague quietly talking with an employee from the payroll department. They stopped talking when they saw me, but the guy from payroll still commented before leaving, something that left me disconcerted. He asked if I knew what had been happening, and recommended that I be careful or avoid lingering in the bathroom. My colleague tried to end the subject, but the other left laughing, leaving an air of mystery. I asked my colleague what he knew, but he preferred not to say anything. I decided not to insist, although curiosity remained. The following week, I needed to spend a few days at another company to distribute payslips and bank cards to new employees. During these tasks, I usually call the receptionist to obtain some necessary details. However, on the second and final day I was there, I couldn't get any response from her. Frustrated, I contacted my boss, and we ended up having a brief discussion. I explained that my delay was the fault of the person assigned to help me, who simply wasn't responding. It was then that my boss, already irritated, commented that the receptionist hadn't come to work because of what had happened the day before. I immediately noticed that she abruptly cut the conversation, as if she had said something she shouldn't have. I asked what had happened, but she returned with the same excuse as before. This time, I decided to act differently. When I returned to the office, I played a trick to get more information. I told the other recruiter that I already knew everything about what had happened with the receptionist. He fell for it, as they say, and began to tell me. My colleague has been working there for about a year and a half longer than me. According to him, situations like this had happened before, but rarely. He began by explaining about the origin of the company, and more specifically, about the history of the building where we work. It seems that the current owners acquired the property in a less than ethical manner. The previous owners had transformed the place into a small orphanage, but ended up bankrupt. It was in this context that the current owners supposedly took advantage of the situation. and bought the place for a value well below the fair price. This move, he said, initiated a series of problems. After the building was renovated and the company inaugurated, something began to happen repeatedly. The bathrooms would become infested with beetles. He told me he had heard about this and later witnessed it personally. It was something strange. Even after frequent pest control treatments, the insects continued to appear as if they never went away. Those who have worked there longer claim that whenever the exterminators arrived, the beetles would disappear, but they would reappear soon after they left. And these insects aren't like cockroaches. They're small and appear in absurd quantities. Even more curious is what his colleagues say. The beetles would be a type of bad omen linked to the owners or the company. Although the idea sounds absurd, he told me that whenever these insects appeared in large quantities in the bathrooms, something bad happened days later, always something related to the company. For example, a few years ago, the company almost closed due to administrative problems, but was saved by the father of one of the partners. On another occasion, the owners suffered a car accident during a trip. Although no one lost their life, they were seriously injured and spent months in the hospital. According to him, these weren't the only times something bad happened, but no one ever gave him complete details. And every time, the pattern was the same. Before any bad event, the bathrooms were taken over by beetles. He also mentioned that after a few days, the insects seemed to dry up and turn to dust, disappearing without a trace. What happened with the receptionist this time was, according to her own account, terrifying. Upon entering the bathroom, the walls and ceiling began to be covered with those insects, and they even started climbing on her. The desperation was such that they had to get her out of there, while she screamed, completely terrified. However, when they arrived, there was no sign of any insect. She didn't know this, and since she had little time at the company, she also wasn't aware that no one liked to talk about these things around there. Although there was no visible evidence, they believed her because it wasn't something unprecedented. My colleague told me that a few months before I started, something similar happened with another employee. This other person said he had seen insects everywhere, on the walls, on the floor, on the ceiling, a true infestation. Although we haven't been directly informed about this, it became clear that the incident with the receptionist was the reason why we've been working from home for 2 weeks. Since then, we've only been to the office once for a specific reason, with the justification that they were carrying out renovations. However, my colleague believes that, in reality, they're just waiting for some bad news. I know that for many, all of this may sound like superstition. I myself thought so for a time, but honestly, I don't believe that's the case. I remember how that colleague was devastated on the day I saw her, and we were still put on remote work because of it. Despite everything, I really like my job and have a good relationship with my colleagues. That's why I don't mention the name of the building in the center here, as it would be easy to identify it. And I don't want to compromise my position in any way. I hope nothing happens, but if that bad news, which has already been announced in a way, does come, I'll let you know. 2 days after sharing this with a close friend, I received an urgent email from HR. The office would remain closed indefinitely due to structural concerns. That same afternoon, the local news reported that the CEO of our company had been arrested on charges of fraud and embezzlement. The investigation had apparently been ongoing for months, and they finally had enough evidence to make an arrest. I called my colleague immediately. "Did you see the news?" "Yeah," he said, his voice tense. "But there's more. They found something else when they were investigating." "What do you mean?" He lowered his voice, though we were on the phone. "Remember those beetles? Turns out they're an extremely rare species that typically only inhabits underground spaces, caves, deep soil, that sort of thing. Almost never above ground." I felt a chill run down my spine. "So how were they getting into our bathrooms?" "That's just it," he continued. "When the FBI searched the building, they discovered a hidden basement level that wasn't on any of the building plans. It was sealed off during the renovation, accessible only through a small utility shaft that connected to the bathroom plumbing." "What was down there?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. "Records," he said. "Decades of records from when it was an orphanage. Apparently, our bosses knew about it the whole time. The orphanage didn't go bankrupt. It was shut down after allegations of abuse and several children going missing. The former director disappeared before he could be questioned." "What does this have to do with the beetles?" He was quiet for a long moment. "They found human remains down there, Rachel. Children's remains. They think some of them had been there since the 60s. The line went silent except for our breathing. "The beetles," I finally whispered. "They were trying to tell us something. Or someone was," he replied. "The forensic entomologist said it was impossible for that many beetles to appear without being introduced deliberately. But no one could figure out how they were getting in or who was bringing them." I couldn't sleep that night, thinking about those small black beetles crawling across bathroom tiles, trying to deliver a message that took too long for anyone to understand. Our company dissolved shortly after, its assets frozen during the investigation. Most of us found jobs elsewhere. But sometimes, when I'm washing my hands in a public restroom, I find myself staring at the drain, half expecting to see a small black beetle emerge, bearing warnings about secrets hidden beneath the foundations of wherever I happen to be standing. My name is Ethan. I've always tried to approach life in a practical manner, but certain events from my childhood shaped how I perceive what many call the unexplainable. I grew up in a small coastal town in Maine, where part of my family still maintains ancient beliefs and traditions. I never was one to spread ghost stories, but I realized early on that some events didn't fit into neat explanations. When I was 7, my mother would often wake me, alarmed, asking who I was talking to in the middle of the night. I couldn't remember anything specific, but I carried the certainty of having seen faceless silhouettes near my bed. When medical exams found nothing wrong with me, my family decided to ignore it and move on. I had inherited my maternal grandparents' house, situated on a rocky bluff overlooking the Atlantic. My grandfather had passed many years before I was born, but my grandmother, Eleanor, was a vibrant and cheerful woman. She told me that in her youth, people would seek healers and wise women when they fell ill. Hospitals weren't talked about much, and what prevailed were traditions passed down through generations. Occasionally, she hinted that some people exploited these beliefs to cause harm. There was a period when my grandmother began noticing my sensitivity to certain signs. She commented that during full moons, I'd grow restless, complaining about hearing creaking in the attic or smelling strong smoke that no one else perceived. Still, she never made me feel afraid. On the contrary, she would say some children are born with their perception door slightly ajar, and that needn't be a bad thing as long as I learned to respect what I didn't understand. Over time, I grew accustomed to strange situations. Sometimes I'd say I sensed a neighbor's death, and days later, someone would indeed pass away. The first time it happened, I didn't want to believe it myself. Then came other similar occasions that made me constantly hesitant to speak about the subject. I learned to stay quiet because I always feared being considered a liar, or worse, seen as some kind of freak. In 2018, I received an opportunity to study at a more established school in another county. I temporarily moved to my uncle's house, my mother's brother. I was excited about having a different routine, but upon arriving, I noticed a tension in the air. People said strange animal deaths had occurred in the area, with no clear evidence of predator attacks. Some locals prayed at nightfall and avoided staying outside after a certain hour. My cousin Lily, 14, told me that the week before my arrival, an unknown elderly woman had knocked on their door asking for pain medicine. But when she answered, there was no one there, only a faint smell of something burnt outside. During that period, the nights seemed quieter than normal. The feeling of insecurity began to disturb me. One night, around 2 a.m, I heard a dry sound near the window of the room where I slept. I got up slowly and tried to look through the gap. I couldn't distinguish any form, but I saw something like a shadow moving irregularly. My heart raced. I thought about calling my uncle, but didn't have the courage to shout. Finally, I gathered my courage and opened the window to see better. There was absolutely nothing in the yard. The silence, however, left me even more distressed. I spent the following days with my head constantly alert to any noise. My aunt and uncle, Rebecca and Thomas, noticed I was nervous but attributed it to the change of town. When I told them what I had seen that night, he laughed and said the region was full of ghost stories. My aunt, more concerned, asked me to pray before sleeping. I preferred not to insist on the subject. I received news that my grandmother, Eleanor, was in fragile health and needed company at her house in the coastal town. She didn't want to move to the city because she said she couldn't bear to lose her independence. Missing her, I decided to go back and keep her company at least on weekends. My uncle, who had an old car, offered to drive me whenever I wanted. That way, I could balance school studies during the week and stay with my grandmother on free days. When I arrived at her house on the first weekend, I noticed she was more dejected. She tried to maintain her good humor, but she frequently shivered and said she had felt strange chills during the night. I noticed some objects in the house seemed out of place. A kettle that was kept in the cupboard appeared on the living room table without explanation. Some candles she used for prayers disappeared from a drawer. She mentioned that perhaps she had forgotten about all this, but I noticed apprehension in her gaze. The next morning, a man named Harold, known to be a healer and prayer leader, knocked on the door. He said he was there to see if he could help the lady, as he had heard from a relative that the homeowner wasn't doing well. My grandmother thanked him for the visit, though she had a suspicious look, as if wondering who had told him about her health. Harold explained that some people in the area commented on having seen an elderly woman with an aged appearance wandering near houses, knocking 3 times on windows, and then disappearing. According to him, this had happened even in more distant neighborhoods. There was also a rumor that this woman carried herbs in a cloth bag and offered mysterious cures in exchange for favors. At first, I thought it was just a local legend. However, on the 3rd night I spent at my grandmother's house, I woke up to noises in the yard. They weren't common sounds. They seemed like light footsteps among the rocks. I decided to turn on the light. When I reached the door, I hesitated. It was almost 1 in the morning. Even so, I gathered courage and opened it to see if anyone was there. I didn't find a living soul, but I had the impression that someone had passed by recently. I can't say I saw footprints, but something in the earth had been disturbed. My grandmother woke up startled by my movements. She called me with a trembling voice, "Ethan, what's happening?" I said it was nothing. She insisted I come in and lock the door. She told me that in recent weeks, she'd wake up with a feeling of weight on her chest, but she forced herself to stay quiet so as not to worry me. I tried to comfort her, but I was apprehensive myself. The following afternoon, she had a sudden turn for the worse. She felt dizzy and started vomiting. I called my parents, who advised me to take her to a health center. We did some tests, and although she had fallen ill, the results showed nothing serious. They prescribed rest and a lighter diet. We returned home, but the previous night's agitation continued in my head. For the rest of the week, I slept in the room next to hers, always alert to any sound. On the 5th night, shortly after I lay down, I heard a hissing sound from the window overlooking the yard. There was no wind, no trees that could cause any scratch on the glass. Despite this, the noise continued for several seconds. Finally, I decided to get up and open the curtain slowly. I saw only darkness, but I was left with the uncomfortable impression that someone had been there just moments before. 2 days later, my mother arrived to visit and talk with my grandmother. Late in the afternoon, we found her sleeping in the armchair, but breathing with difficulty. My mother tried to wake her, and she, somewhat dazed, mentioned she had dreamed of a woman with tangled hair who asked to enter the house. Later, my grandmother didn't remember the words she had said, but described the sensation of being trapped in a disjointed conversation. It was as if the woman demanded something from her, and she couldn't refuse. In the following days, we received a visit from a woman who came to see my grandmother. Her name was Gertrude, but they said she was known for praying for the sick. She asked me if any strangers had appeared in the region recently. I told her about Harold's story, and also mentioned the rumors of an aged woman knocking on doors. Gertrude looked at me with a serious expression. "Be careful, my boy. Sometimes evil presents itself as medicine." I didn't quite understand what she meant, but I felt uneasy. My nights became agitated again. I dreamed of my grandmother talking to someone outside the gate, but the conversation wasn't audible. When I tried to approach, I'd wake up sweating. To complicate matters, she started to grow weaker, having difficulty even with routine activities. My parents and my uncles joined forces to accompany her to the hospital again. Nothing was detected beyond mild anemia. Then something unusual happened. A cousin of mine, Derek, who lived in the same town, appeared saying he had seen a hooded person prowling around my grandmother's yard. According to him, this figure stopped at the gate, and upon realizing it was being observed, turned around and left without looking back. When I tried to ask for more details, Derek changed the subject. He said he didn't want to get involved in stories of witchcraft or neighborhood disputes. My Uncle Thomas, who already knew some healing practices and prayers, decided to talk to Harold, the healer who had appeared earlier. I didn't have high expectations, but I was willing to try anything that might help improve the atmosphere in the house. In the afternoon when Harold came, I stayed in the hallway listening to him talk to my grandmother in a low voice. He left with a concerned expression, saying only that he would say a strong prayer and return on another occasion. He didn't explain much, but left a bundle of herbs to burn all night, recommending that the smoke travel through all the rooms. On the first night after this simple ritual, something woke me around 3 o'clock. My grandmother was moaning in her room. I ran to her and noticed she was sweating profusely and speaking incoherent words, as if in the midst of a deep nightmare. Despite this, her eyes remained open. I tried to calm her, but she was in a state I had never seen before. I woke my mother, who was sleeping in the other room. While my mother asked for calm, I noticed my grandmother was whispering someone's name, but I couldn't quite understand. In the days that followed, I didn't sleep well. I became sick with worry, living with frequent headaches. I started having those occasional visions of apparitions that I had in childhood. But now everything was mixed together: my grandmother's illness, the fear that something even worse might happen, the feeling that the house was no longer the same. One day, I heard my grandmother talking to herself by the living room window. She spoke in a low voice, as if negotiating something. I approached quietly and asked if everything was okay. She immediately stopped talking and looked at me in surprise, unable to explain what she was doing. She had tears in her eyes, but didn't want to go into details. She only asked me not to leave her alone at night. In this context of tension, an elderly woman appeared on the road saying she was looking for a delivery at a Leaner's house. I asked who she was and what she was looking for. She looked at me strangely, as if she already knew me. She had a well-defined face and hair tied in a scarf. She said she needed to deliver medicine for the sick lady, but didn't go into details. When I told her my grandmother was resting, the woman's expression closed. If she doesn't take the medicine, she'll get worse. I argued that we couldn't trust just anything. She continued, the diseases of the body begin in the soul. If we ignore them, death comes quickly. The conversation intrigued me, but I refused the package she offered. It made no sense to accept something without knowing what it was. The stranger left with firm steps, disappearing around the bend in the road. Later, I commented to my mother. She was concerned and said I should have spoken with this person to better understand the origin of the medicine. I preferred not to tell her that the woman's expression had given me chills. Shortly after, my grandmother's health deteriorated completely. She had high fevers for several nights. She was delirious and talked about voices calling her outside. We went to the hospital, and again the tests showed nothing. My mother decided we would take her to stay at another uncle's house in a busier neighborhood. We thought that away from that isolated place, she would improve. But even there, she continued weak, and with a distant look. I stayed for a few days, worried, but returned to complete my school activities. One afternoon, I received a phone call from my cousin Jack, letting me know that my grandmother had passed away. He didn't go into details, but said it was all very quick. I remember his exact words. "It seems like she left as someone who gives up fighting." I was paralyzed. A whirlwind of guilt hit me. I remembered the woman who appeared offering the medicine, and how I refused. I remembered my grandmother's words when she mentioned someone calling at the door. It seemed like all the pieces made sense, and at the same time, none fit. I packed my things and went to my uncle's house, where she was being waked. Arriving there, I found the atmosphere dense. The family was gathered in the living room around the coffin, and among the people, I could distinguish the presence of the same lady who had offered me the medicine. She didn't look at anyone. She seemed to just stare at my grandmother's body with a certain indifference. I decided to approach, but when I got close, she turned around and left. I didn't follow her. I was too shaken to confront her. During the wake, I heard a murmur from relatives saying the cause of death remained undefined. Some commented she might have been involved in something spiritual that escaped medicine. Others thought it was just age and fatigue. My mother cried and hugged me. At certain moments, I felt as if I lacked air, as if there was something in that room pushing me away. I thought it was just grief. The burial took place the following morning. I saw no more sign of that strange lady. Even so, I couldn't get her image out of my head. I kept wondering if my grandmother would have escaped this fate if I had accepted the medicine. Despite rational explanations, a feeling of remorse consumed me. I returned home without enthusiasm. I started having recurring dreams where I saw my grandmother calling me to a stream. But before I could reach her hand, someone emerged behind her, preventing me from touching her. I'd wake up with my heart racing. One night, I had such a vivid nightmare that I had to get up and drink water to calm down. Suddenly, I heard 3 sharp knocks on the door. I went to check with my phone's flashlight, but found no one. I talked to Harold and asked him to help me understand what was happening. He received me on the porch of his house, where he kept various herb bundles hanging. I spoke openly about the woman, how she offered the medicine, and how my grandmother died soon after. He remained silent for a few moments before saying, "Ethan, there are people who believe that evil extends from generation to generation. Be careful not to inherit something your grandmother was facing." That idea shocked me. I asked what I should do. He suggested protection with prayers and smudging, but emphasized that, in the end, everyone must find their own strength to face what they don't understand. Some time passed. I tried to go on with life normally, but my dreams continued to be disturbing. I started feeling constant headaches, as if something was pressing on my temples. I tried to distract myself by walking down the street, talking with friends, but always with a discomfort hovering around. It was on one of those nights, as I was returning home, that I spotted a figure standing near the gate. The street was poorly lit. It seemed like someone dressed in worn clothes. I felt my body freeze. When I got closer, there was no one there. My Uncle Thomas noticed my state of tension and decided to take me to a woman named Iris, whom many called a healer. She lived in a simple house near a stream, and attended people from various places. I related to her everything that had been happening. Iris asked to hold my hand and closed her eyes. She didn't tell me anything extraordinary, just that I harbored a grief that served as an invitation to negative influences. She suggested I participate in a prayer by the stream, where she usually did her prayers. The day before we went, I had a strange dream. I saw my grandmother in a clear, almost empty environment, and she pointed to my chest as if she wanted to remind me of something important. I woke up and found myself mentally repeating the words she used to comfort me in childhood. It seemed like her presence still existed somehow, trying to give me strength. On the appointed morning, we walked to the stream. Iris scattered some leaves over the water and asked me to breathe deeply, thinking of my grandmother and asking forgiveness for any failure. I did as she suggested, feeling a bit strange but hopeful. There was no extravagant phenomenon, just a climate of tranquility that I hadn't felt for weeks. Still, I looked at the edges of the trees, as if expecting to see someone or something hidden. In the weeks that followed, I began to improve. The nightmares diminished, the headaches became less frequent. I began to understand that much of my suffering was fueled by guilt and fear. It was during this period that Iris explained to me that in many cases, we believe there is an evil power outside of us, but we don't always consider what we nurture inside. She didn't claim there was nothing supernatural. She just encouraged me not to surrender to obsession. Gradually, the memory of my grandmother became a source of comfort instead of a trigger for sadness. Despite the memories of that mysterious lady, I began to face the possibility that much of what happened could have a less fantastic explanation. Perhaps the rumors, the fragility of health, the desperation for a quick cure, and my own gift of seeing signs created a confusing scenario. Still, I couldn't completely discard the idea that there was something beyond what my eyes could see. Today, I try to maintain my balance. I take care of the house that was my grandmother's without forgetting her teachings. I keep some prayers I learned from people like Harold and Iris. But I don't live obsessed trying to prove whether or not there are occult forces. There are nights when I think I hear some strange noise in the yard, but I breathe deeply and go on with my life. Inside me, I still carry that feeling that I lost the chance to save my grandmother by refusing the help offered by the strange woman. However, if there's something this experience taught me, it's that the answers don't always come from outside. Sometimes what we need is to accept our own conscience and learn to deal with what we don't understand without letting fear control every step. My mother passed away when I was 4 years old, and since then, I was raised solely by my father, a man known to everyone as Nathan. He always had a reputation for being serious and impatient, but he never lacked encouragement when it came to education. He would say that if I wanted a different future, I should open books and make an effort. Perhaps it was his way of dealing with his own pain. He clung to the idea that I needed to grow up with better opportunities than he had. When I turned 18, I did something that seemed unthinkable to me at the time. I asked my father's permission to study law in Seattle. He agreed, although without showing much enthusiasm. He said he would send me a little money while I worked temporary jobs, as long as I didn't abandon classes. I accepted without hesitation. It was my chance to leave the ranch, or homestead, as my father called it, and experience life in the big city. Even from a distance, I maintained almost daily contact with the ranch, asking about the herd, the crops, and my father's condition. Still, whenever I called, he avoided talking much about himself. He said he was fine, just needed more hands to help with tasks since the place wasn't small. I missed certain things: the smell of wet earth after rain, the simplicity of meals cooked on a wood stove, the rooster crowing before sunrise. But overall, I was happy with the freedom that the city provided me. At the beginning of the third semester, however, everything fell apart. I was leaving a criminal law class when I received a call from Martha, who had worked at the ranch forever. Her voice was trembling. She told me that my father was very ill, without strength to get up, and that home remedies weren't having any effect. From her words, I understood it could be something serious. I felt a tightness in my chest. I had never seen my father complain of pain or any discomfort, and that knocked me down. I gathered my things and took the first bus back to Wyoming without thinking about anything else. I arrived at night. Martha received me at the gate with a suffering look and a hug that seemed a desperate attempt to show that everything would be fine. After walking through the darkened yard, I entered my father's room and encountered a scene that marked me. He was pale, sweating cold, and breathing with difficulty. He mumbled something that I interpreted as an apology for taking me out of college. It was the only phrase he managed to pronounce before returning to a heavy silence. In the days that followed, I tried to convince him to go to Seattle for examinations, but he wouldn't give up on staying right there. He said that if it was time to go, he wanted to be near his land. In the meantime, I took on an exhausting routine. I would wake before dawn to check on the cattle, see what needed repair, negotiate debts I discovered stashed in drawers, and somehow try to continue studying on my own. The ranch wasn't small, but the state of abandonment in some areas frightened me. It didn't take long for me to realize that besides my father's illness, there was a whirlwind of economic problems. One afternoon, I passed by the local grocery store to buy some supplies and heard comments about a newly arrived young woman in the area. They spoke of her reserved manner with almost always dark clothes, and how she caught attention wherever she went. That was just a rumor that entered my ear without causing much interest, since I was only thinking about resolving pending issues and trying to alleviate my father's suffering. I was never much for parties or gossip, so I left the subject alone. However, fate sometimes plays tricks on us. About 3 weeks later, there was a festival in the region. Live music, food stalls, bonfires, and banners hung from posts. I thought it might be a chance to talk with other ranchers, and perhaps sell some of the cows to settle immediate debts. I arrived at the location and stood observing people dancing and laughing. Amidst those colored lights, I spotted someone who stood out from the rest. A tall woman in a black dress with dark hair falling over her shoulders. And there I was, noticing her with the same curiosity she apparently showed towards me. We exchanged somewhat awkward glances, and when I tried to move away, she approached with a determined air. She introduced herself as Vanessa, asking if I was responsible for Nathan's ranch. I nodded without understanding how she knew about my life. She greeted me with a slight smile, said a few loose sentences about how she had moved recently, and soon offered to talk in a quieter place. I found it all too fast, but I felt strangely attracted by the intensity with which she spoke. We ended up moving away from the festival, and she took me by car to a little-traveled dirt road. We stopped at a point where there was almost no light. It was one of the most impulsive moments of my life. We kissed with haste and almost a kind of urgency. When she dropped me back at my door, I was still processing what had happened. I couldn't sleep, dwelling on that memory that oscillated between desire and guilt. After all, my father was deteriorating in a room just a few meters away. In the days that followed, I kept in contact with Vanessa through messages. Whenever my cell phone beeped, a hope arose of reliving those intense moments, and at the same time, a fear. I wasn't in a condition to get involved with anyone. I needed to take care of the place, take care of my father, solve financial problems, and still deal with the feeling of powerlessness in the face of his illness. However, she called me to increasingly daring meetings in remote places. She even proposed visiting the local cemetery at night, claiming to enjoy the silence and mysterious atmosphere. It was bizarre, but somehow intriguing. Until then, I had no concrete reasons to be suspicious of her, just found everything strange. Despite it being a frightening proposal at minimum, I ended up accepting. Perhaps it was the desperation of someone mired in tasks and internal conflicts. So we went to that small cemetery with low walls and ancient graves. We jumped over a semi-open gate and settled behind an old tombstone. No one saw us. Each time I kissed her, I felt a wave of euphoria, but soon after I was overcome by a profound exhaustion, as if I had been running for hours. It was different from any experience I had before. As weeks passed, my father's health deteriorated. He spent days between fevers and pain crises that I could barely watch without despairing. I didn't have money for hospitalization or specialized treatment, and he refused to be taken far from there. During this same period, the herd fell ill in a strange way, and in a few days, I lost 2 cows without a plausible explanation. It seemed like everything around was crumbling. Martha helped as she could, but she herself was overwhelmed. Once in a while, she would ask me where I was going so late, and I would lie, inventing some story about suppliers in another town. Each time I met with Vanessa, I returned more confused and debilitated. She drained my energy. I don't know how better to define it, but it was as if the air around us grew heavy. Still, I couldn't say no. She also moved to a house closer to the ranch, arguing that this way she could support me in my routine. In practice, however, she would disappear whenever a concrete problem arose, claiming headaches or some mysterious indisposition. My father entered a severe respiratory crisis, and the local doctor was emphatic. Either he would go to a reference hospital, or his chances of survival would be minimal. I tried to convince him again, and once more he refused, saying he preferred to end his life where it all began. It was agonizing. I spent nights without sleep, trying to resolve ranch matters and still keeping vigils by his bedside. Vanessa, in turn, didn't show great concern and insisted that I relax with her during the early morning hours in increasingly sinister places. On the night my father passed away, I felt an indescribable pain. It was something that left a hole inside me. Vanessa consoled me in a cold manner. She even suggested that life is that way, that people leave when their time comes. Words that seemed empty to me. Martha organized a simple wake at the cemetery with some neighbors and friends. Burying my father there, in that same place I furtively visited with Vanessa, made me feel absurd guilt. It crossed my mind that maybe I should have done something different. I should have interrupted my useless outings and had more focus on his health. After that, problems continued to accumulate. Some fences began to break without my finding an explanation. The cattle became agitated during the nights, and rumors spread that there was something bad prowling around the ranch. I slept poorly, waking up sweating and breathless, but thought it was stress. Vanessa remained at my house, arguing that now we needed to be more united than ever. However, when I tried to delegate something to her, she would disappear for hours. Martha, concerned, called an acquaintance of hers, Mrs. Doris, to help us with cleaning and cooking. This lady arrived suddenly with few bags and a firm look. The moment Vanessa saw her, she became tense, complaining of headaches due to the smell of herbs that Mrs. Doris burned to purify the environment. I didn't know whether to believe in this purification story, but any help was welcome, especially since in the first days she was there, the ranch routine seemed a little less chaotic. One night, Mrs. Doris called me for a conversation in the kitchen. She said she felt something strange lingering in the house. She asked if I had any idea who Vanessa was, where she came from, and why she showed such obsession with staying at the ranch. I was left without an answer. Deep down, I also didn't understand how everything happened so suddenly. The little I knew was that Vanessa had appeared out of nowhere, bringing a disturbing atmosphere. However, I couldn't stay away from her. The suspicions didn't stop there. Martha told me some ranch hands had quit, claiming to see strange movements during the early morning hours and preferring not to risk their lives. I didn't feel comfortable hearing that, but I also couldn't force anyone to stay. Vanessa, meanwhile, continued to call me for nocturnal escapes. There was one night when we met near a centennial tree. As soon as we returned, I had a high fever and nausea that lasted until the next morning. A few days later, I received a visit from a man named Anthony, who said he represented a group of investors. He handed me a card, commenting that he knew of my financial difficulties and that he could buy part of the land at an interesting price. I was tempted because the accumulated debts were enormous, but I felt blocked by the memory of my father and the value he always gave to the land. I asked for time to think. Anthony left, warning that the offer wouldn't last long. That same day, I noticed that Vanessa disappeared for almost the entire afternoon. She only reappeared at nightfall with a heavy countenance and a nauseating perfume. She told me it was time to do something different at the cemetery, a kind of ritual to feel more free. That sounded strange, but I was so worn out that I accepted. We went there, jumped over the gate once more, and amidst the shadows of the graves, I fell to my knees. It was as if my legs couldn't support my body's weight. And at that moment, I didn't see anything clearly supernatural, but I had the distinct impression that there was some form of disturbing presence near us. I returned home, almost dragged by Vanessa. I only regained full consciousness before dawn, with a ringing in my ears. When I woke up, she wasn't in the room. I was dizzy for a while until I managed to get up. The sun was already rising, and I heard Mrs. Doris's voice coming from the yard, intoning some kind of prayer. I felt a pang of relief, even without fully understanding the prayers of that lady. It was comforting to see her firm amidst so much chaos. It was the following night that everything came to light. Mrs. Doris announced she would perform a spiritual defense in the house, asked Martha to stand by, and recommended I not go out, especially with Vanessa. At first, I agreed, but Vanessa's insistence for us to go for a walk was so great that I almost gave in. Mrs. Doris, however, opened the windows and began to spread what looked like salt mixed with herbs. At that moment, Vanessa began to feel ill. First, she sat on the floor, saying the smell was unbearable. Then she got up stumbling, as if trying to exit hastily through the door. When I tried to help, she pushed me and blurted out disconnected words that transformed into a confession. Vanessa screamed that Nathan was her father, that he had rejected her in the past, helping to expel her mother from their decades before. Her head was filled with hatred, but also with pain. She spoke in a way that made it noticeable. It wasn't just about financial revenge. There was a desire to cause total destruction, to see the ranch crumble, and if possible, drain my future along with it. I was paralyzed, unable to react. Mrs. Doris and Martha intervened. While the elderly woman raised an object resembling a small wooden crucifix, Vanessa staggered, spat offensive words, and sobbed. It was at this moment that I understood the extent of it all. My father, already at the end of his life, never had the courage to tell me I had a half-sister, and she, driven by her mother's rancor, planned every detail to get close to me, gain my confidence, and sink the ranch. I found the strength to grab Vanessa's arm and lead her to the living room door. She resisted but was weak. She threw some suitcases on the floor, took only 2 bags, and left without looking back. I watched without saying anything as she disappeared on the dusty dirt road. I returned inside with trembling legs. This time it wasn't exhaustion from forbidden kisses or clandestine meetings. It was the shock of discovering that I had had an intimate relationship with someone of my own blood, even without knowing. Mrs. Doris continued her prayers throughout the house, left candles at strategic points, smudged the rooms, and asked Martha and me to collaborate by maintaining order and cleaning rituals. In the days that followed, I avoided going out at night and dedicated myself to reorganizing the accounts. Gradually, my body began to recover from a fatigue I didn't even know could disappear. The fever ceased, the headaches diminished, and even the cattle seemed calmer. It was as if a weight had been lifted from us. Anthony, the man who wanted to buy part of the ranch, returned to pressure me. He wanted an immediate answer. I looked at the still messy place full of debts, but realized that place carried the memory of my father and my childhood. I couldn't sell. He left somewhat disgruntled, saying there might be other offers. I thought to myself that if I was going to start over, let it be right there, honestly, and without completely giving up the dream my father had for me. With Mrs. Doris's daily spiritual cleaning and Martha's help, the ranch began to breathe. I organized a group effort to fix the fences and forwarded some animals for sale, resolving the most urgent debts. Within weeks, the environment gained a new vibe. We still lacked manpower, but some ranch hands returned when they heard that strange presence was no longer prowling the house. In the second month after Vanessa's departure, I felt like visiting my father's grave. I went there with a lump in my throat, but now without panic. I stood looking at the still fresh earth and spoke in a low voice that despite everything, I loved him and was taking care of the ranch. I felt a deep sadness, but also relief to realize I was no longer trapped in any spell, if I can call it that. The things that happened still shook me, but I could see a light at the end of the tunnel. Each week, the ranch was rebuilding itself, and I was finding myself again. I thought about resuming my law studies, but at that moment, I still considered it more important to resolve the ranch situation once and for all. I received another interested buyer, but the proposal was fairer and would allow me to keep most of the land. I analyzed it thoroughly, and after much reflection, decided to sell only a small portion to settle the definitive debts. It remained a much smaller territory, but sufficient for me to be able to invest in new crops and maintain the cattle. After that, my days became a routine of waking up early, caring for the animals, checking the accounts, and at the end of the day, working on the planting beds. Martha continued with me, now practically like a second mother. Mrs. Doris, after some time, returned to the city where she lived, but said she would return if I needed help again. She left me with some instructions for prayer and protection that, as a precaution, I followed. I never saw Vanessa again. There were rumors that she went to another region, but I never sought to confirm. Even today, I feel a mixture of nausea and bitterness when remembering how I was almost destroyed by that rancor accumulated over years on end. What consoles me is knowing that now things are in order, and that perhaps I can resume my interrupted dreams. Taking care of the land became my priority, but who knows, one day I might find time to return to classes in Seattle. If there's something I've learned, it's that we can't escape from family secrets for very long. They find a way to emerge, even if it's through the darkest circumstances. For now, I continue here, finishing these lines at the end of a quiet afternoon, with the sun setting behind the hills. On the porch, I feel the breeze passing lightly and observe the cattle grazing. Martha calls me for dinner, and I go with a more peaceful heart, even carrying scars that don't erase. The ranch continues standing, different and reduced, but alive. And I continue with the purpose of honoring the memory of my father in the best way possible, free from any shadow that tried to settle here. My name is Marcus, and until about 3 months ago, I was living a rather ordinary life, sharing an apartment with roommates and surviving on odd jobs in the city. But suddenly, everything changed. I was summoned to appear at a lawyer's office, who claimed to have something important to communicate to me. I arrived without knowing exactly what to expect, thinking it might be some bureaucratic problem related to my parents' deaths. They died in a car accident almost a year ago, but instead, I received news that I had inherited a property from a great uncle I had never heard of. The lawyer explained that this great uncle, whose name was Vincent, lived as a recluse and had few contacts with the rest of the family. According to him, Vincent left everything to me for lack of other direct heirs. I discovered, somewhat startled, that my parents knew of this distant relative's existence, but preferred never to speak of him. I don't know if there were disagreements or some unresolved secret. The lawyer also didn't have much information, only reported that the property was in terrible condition and that Vincent had died of natural causes months earlier, without anyone realizing his passing for quite some time. To be honest, I had no reason to keep the old apartment in the city. I was unemployed and without great prospects. The idea of starting life anew in a different place strangely appealed to me. So I decided to go there and see with my own eyes what condition the property was in, and perhaps move for good. If it was unfeasible, I would sell the property and try to use the money to resume studies or open a business. The next day, I packed my bags, took a bus to the nearest county in northern Arizona, and from there continued in a chartered pickup truck. The driver left me at the main gate, and I had to walk about 20 minutes to reach the house. The path was beaten dirt, surrounded by broken fences and abandoned pastures. When I spotted the property's main building, I realized the place had been forgotten for a long time. There were loose boards on the walls, broken windows, and missing roof tiles. I couldn't help but wonder how Vincent might have lived there in recent years. Inside the house, the scene was no less desolate. The floor was dirty, with marks of accumulated dust. I immediately noticed that many pieces of furniture had been left behind. I opened the windows to let the air circulate and explored the rooms. I found a room that appeared to be my great uncle's. It was filled with old notebooks and some objects that caused me certain estrangement: stone amulets, dark-colored candles, and a cloth that had embroidered designs I didn't recognize. When I say I didn't recognize them, I don't just mean not knowing what they meant, but never having seen symbols like those before. I kept wondering if Vincent had some kind of involvement with mysticism, or simply liked collecting strange things. I preferred to put everything in a corner without judging. With the house in terrible condition, I decided to do a preliminary cleaning to at least be able to spend the first night. I separated a mattress I found in better condition and cleaned one of the rooms. Only then did I notice that despite the precarious structure, there was something interesting there. The property was large, with plenty of cultivation space and a beautiful view of the fields. Perhaps there was potential to rebuild everything. That first late afternoon, I went out to look at what remained of animals. Near a rusted corral, I found only a very thin horse and a solitary pig that walked aimlessly. At the time, I wondered how they still survived after Vincent's death. I noticed, however, that there was a small creek at the back of the property with clean water, and nearby, an old orchard of wild fruits still alive. I also discovered some sealed bags of feed next to the corral, which meant that for the last few months, the animals could have managed between the creek water, fallen fruits, and possible remains of feed. When night came, I began to feel discomfort. I don't know if it was the profound darkness. There was no electric light outside the house, and even inside, the installation worked poorly, or if it was just the fact of being alone in an isolated place. I decided to go to bed early, since there wasn't much to do. I fell asleep faster than expected, but couldn't rest for very long. Around the middle of the night, a noise awakened me. It seemed like the creaking of a heavy door being forced. or perhaps the wind pushing some loose sheet of zinc. I got up and, groping in the dark, tried to discover where the sound was coming from. I went to the living room and noticed that the door leading to the porch was ajar, even though I was certain I had locked it. When I carefully opened it, I saw no one outside. It was just the silence of the property. However, there was something curious. The rusty chain I had used to reinforce the door was on the ground as if it had been cut. I stood still for several seconds, trying to understand what might have happened. It could be a thief, someone looking for something of value. But I doubted there was anything valuable there. The next day, I woke up with a certain relief upon seeing the light invading the house. I went to the corral to check on the animals. They were agitated, especially the pig, which was running from one side to the other. I noticed there were footprints in the ground near the stable, but they didn't look like shoes or bare feet. They had a triangular shape, with two sharp points at the front. I wondered if they could be marks of some wild animal. The region is rural, and it wouldn't be impossible for a large animal like a tapir or a wild boar to have passed by during the night. But the step was very straight and organized, almost in a line. This intrigued me. I spent the rest of the day organizing the internal rooms, washed part of the floor, and threw away a lot of unusable junk. I separated my great Uncle Vincent's notebooks and was surprised when leafing through one or another. It seemed he was noting visions or dreams. Some texts described humanoid figures and rituals that, in his words, served for communication with ancient forces. On other pages, there were drawings of something that resembled a beast mixed with a man. They were sketches without much sense, but they caused me uneasiness. When night fell, I prepared a little food, turned on a flashlight I had saved, and checked if the doors were well closed. I tried to organize my thoughts. Was Vincent involved with some esoteric group for his entire life? Or did he just dedicate himself to eccentric readings? I had no answer, and at that moment I could only deal with what was urgent. I needed to ensure no one would enter the house again. I barred the windows, placed a piece of wood as a barrier on the front door, and still felt insecure. I fell asleep again, but this time near midnight I heard the horse neighing. The sound came from outside, insistent as if it were frightened. I grabbed the flashlight and went to the porch. I illuminated the corral that was a few meters away. The horse was moving incessantly. Even in the dark, I could see that its neck hair was bristled and its breathing was rapid. I looked around and saw nothing. I went back inside, thinking if some wild animal could have come close. In any case, I confirmed that the chains on the corral remained intact and decided to try to sleep again. But the rest of the night was a mixture of naps and frights. Any creak left me alert. The next day, I took the opportunity to go to the nearest small settlement and buy supplies. There was nothing more than a small store and a warehouse, but I managed to get the basics: canned food, candles, and tools to fix fences. While I was paying, the attendant, who seemed curious, decided to start a conversation. "Are you related to that gentleman who lived alone on the property?" I nodded, explaining briefly that I had inherited the place. He furrowed his brow. "People around here don't talk much about him, but they know strange things happened there." I put on a face of someone who doesn't understand and asked what he was referring to. The man averted his eyes. "I don't know well. Some say they heard noises during the night, people crying or screaming, but they never confirmed anything. Well, if you need help, I'm around here." I thanked him, somewhat disconcerted. I returned to the property with a tightness in my chest. What, after all, did Vincent do? And what were those bizarre ritual notes I had found? I tried to convince myself they were just stories to drive away the curious. After all, each region has its legends. When I returned, I found things apparently normal, but the environment remained tense. I took advantage of the new tools to fix a fence near the corral. As soon as I began the work, I noticed movement amidst bushes further ahead. I even thought it might be a coyote or another animal. I continued hammering the nails, trying not to give much importance to it. From time to time, I looked and saw nothing, but the feeling persisted, as if there was someone or some animal hidden. Shortly before nightfall, I decided to gather the horse and the pig into a safer area, confining them in a smaller space next to the house. I threw a little feed, and while feeding them, I thought about how life there could even be simple, but it demanded a lot of adaptability. I suspected that my gray tuncle lived isolated not only by choice, but possibly out of fear of something that nobody quite understood. At night, I locked myself in, leaving the flashlight and a machete within reach. And it was on this third night that things got more serious. I woke up startled by the sound of something heavy beating against the kitchen door. It seemed like someone was trying to break it down. My heart raced, and I gripped the machete, not knowing whether I should shout or approach to see. The beats were spaced, and after a few attempts, they suddenly stopped. I remained silent for a few moments, hearing only my breathing and that of the horse that seemed nervous outside. I walked to the kitchen, illuminating with the flashlight. The door hadn't been opened, but it had scratches that didn't look like a knife or crowbar marks. They were irregular cuts, as if they were enormous nails or something sharp that had scraped the wood. I took a deep breath and began to seriously question if there was someone with bad intentions in the region. Perhaps thieves who used primitive tools or something like that. But when I opened the door to check outside, I saw footprint marks in the ground again, similar to those I had found near the stable. They had that same triangular aspect with 2 points in front, reinforcing my suspicion that they weren't human footprints. In the days that followed, the routine was marked by a kind of constant suspense. During the day, I gradually repaired the installations and tried to normalize life on the property. During the night, I heard noises. They weren't always very clear, sometimes a distant grunt, sometimes a rustling of something large moving. The horse became quite agitated, and I had to reinforce the corral walls to prevent it from escaping. The pig, on the other hand, started to stay cowered in a corner, avoiding even approaching me. One afternoon, while cleaning a ruined shed at the back of the property, I found an old notebook under a crate. It had notes similar to those in Vincent's room. It spoke of rituals with offerings, of ways to ward off creatures of the threshold, and of a supposed pact established many years ago. The final pages listed sacrificed animals and dates written in full, as if they were records of something macabre. I didn't read it all. I stopped because it caused me extreme discomfort. That same day, I decided to seek some help. I called an old family acquaintance Mr. Paul, who lived in a not-too-distant county and had worked with my father. I explained that I was alone on a property full of problems. He promptly agreed to appear the next day. To my surprise, he arrived in the morning driving an old pickup truck, bringing a smile to his face. "I didn't know you were related to this Vincent fellow," he commented as we walked toward the house. "I heard some stories about him, but I prefer not to get involved in rumors." He helped me drag boards, change some roof tiles, and primarily gave me advice on how to deal with possible intruders. He installed stronger latches and reinforced the kitchen door with iron bars. I didn't want to tell everything that had happened, but I mentioned that someone or something was appearing there during the night. He frowned. "If you need, I can stay a few nights here. I'll sleep in the shed, and we'll see if we can catch whoever it is." I accepted, relieved. I thought that with another person around, I would feel safer. But it wasn't quite like that. That night, Paul and I kept vigil, taking turns. Around 1 in the morning, I heard a noise outside and called Paul with a flashlight signal. We went to the back window without making a noise. We couldn't see much, just the silhouette of the corral and some trees swaying slowly. When I returned to the living room, I heard the horse neighing and then a thundering sound. We ran outside, but saw nothing beyond the fences swinging. The corral door was open, even though I was sure I had locked it. The horse was at the edge of the pasture, almost escaping, but we managed to catch it. The pig, in turn, disappeared for a few minutes and only returned at dawn, mysteriously emerging between the bushes with its snout dirty with soil. In the morning, we found fresh footprints similar to the previous ones. This time they appeared more clearly, revealing those 2 elongated points at the front and a larger part behind, like a strange hoof. Paul wore a serious expression. I don't know if this is a person in disguise satisfying some sinister mania, or if it's really an animal, but it doesn't look like wild boar tracks. He stayed until late afternoon and left, promising to return in a few days. I went asleep, but as the sun disappeared, that anguish returned. I was beginning to suspect that my great uncle indeed performed strange practices, and that somehow it had left a trace. I didn't go so far as to think of curses or spirits. Perhaps they were people who had some interest in rituals on the property, without caring about invading at night. Without concrete evidence, it would be difficult to call the police. And to be honest, I feared that if it was indeed something more serious, the authorities wouldn't believe it. The tension only increased. The following night, I heard a very loud noise coming from Vincent's room. Inside, what I found left me petrified. One of the windows was wide open, even though I had closed everything, and the mattress was overturned. It looked like someone had entered. On the desk, there was a clay pot that I didn't remember being there before. Inside the pot, some pasty substance of dark color exhaled a terrible odor, as if it were the remains of some decomposing animal. I backed away and tried not to vomit. I spent the night mulling over thoughts about who would be capable of doing that. 2 days later, Paul returned, but had to leave at the end of the same day to resolve personal matters. I was alone again. I tried to deal with everything without letting paranoia dominate me, but it was increasingly difficult. When new knocks came on the door one night, I ended up shouting, "Who's there?" "What do you want?" The knocks ceased. Then a voice, or something that resembled a human voice, grunted some unintelligible words from outside. This froze my blood because it wasn't a clear sound, but rather something that grazed between syllables and grumbles. I remained quiet, locked in the living room, waiting. After some time, more silence. The next day, I saw marks of soil on the wall, as if something had been leaning there, supporting itself while trying to reach the window. It was then that I decided to sell everything. I realized I didn't have the conditions to manage that property. I didn't want to stay there living under an endless nocturnal dread. And to be honest, I didn't feel a special love for the place. I needed money. I needed to rebuild my life elsewhere. The problem is that selling an old property, distant and full of problems, is not so simple. I contacted a realtor from the region and asked for urgency. He, however, said few would be interested in something in the state it was in. The solution was to put a price below market, hoping that someone willing to invest in renovation would appear. To my surprise, a local investor emerged willing to analyze the land quickly. From what the realtor commented, this buyer was looking for large rural areas for an agricultural restructuring project. That's why he was willing to face the risks and inspect everything with some urgency. I agreed, as I couldn't waste time. During this process, the nocturnal attacks continued. Even trying not to become obsessed, I wasn't sleeping well anymore. Until one night, the horse broke through the corral and dashed into the brush. In the midst of so much confusion, I ran after it with the flashlight, but didn't manage to reach it. I ended up in a part of the property where I had never been before, surrounded by dense vegetation. There, illuminating precariously, I found a small construction made of stone, almost like an abandoned shelter or chapel. The door was open, and inside there were traces of recent fire and a series of inscriptions on the ground similar to those in Vincent's notebooks. I backed away, frightened, as this confirmed that at some point, rituals or something of the sort had occurred. It could be the location where Vincent made his offerings. I didn't stay to investigate. The next day, I returned more calmly, trying to record everything with my cell phone. But due to lack of signal, the filming turned out terrible. Still, I took photos of the symbols and what appeared to be small bones, probably from birds. In one corner, I saw a rope and a cloth stained with a reddish tone. I also noticed nearby something that looked like a small tuft of thick hair stuck to a dry branch. When I touched it, I smelled a rancid odor, totally different from any local animal I knew. After this finding, I did everything possible to organize myself and get out of there. I told the realtor I was in a hurry. He made an effort and managed to schedule the investor's visit so everything could be concluded. With that, I only needed to stay there for about 2 more weeks, time to finalize the paperwork. The following nights were a terror. There were grunts coming from the woods, constant knocks on the windows, and some attacks on the walls, always leaving scratches or pieces of wood torn off. The pig disappeared without a trace, and I thought I heard it squealing in the distance. I started sleeping leaning against the wall of my room, with the machete in hand. I would wake up with any minimal noise. I felt pains in my body, and my head was on the verge of collapse. The day came when the realtor called me, saying the new buyer would stop by to see everything before signing the contract. By coincidence, I was packing my bags emptying closets, and even giving the house a general cleanup so that at least it would seem less horrible. Late in the afternoon, this buyer appeared, a robust man accompanied by a woman who said she was an agricultural engineer. I showed them the property, trying to appear neutral. I didn't lie about the abandonment, but I omitted the supernatural or strange facts. Even so, they seemed suspicious of the structure, mainly because of the damage to the doors and windows. The next day after he left, I found a note left on the porch. "Don't forget to warn about who lived here before." I felt a chill reading it as it wasn't signed, and I didn't know if it had been left by the buyer himself or by someone else. I preferred to ignore it and pretend I hadn't seen it. On the penultimate day, I slept practically nothing. There was a total silence around, as if the property and the woods had entered a pause. I didn't even hear the sound of nocturnal insects. I tried not to be distressed, but it was impossible. I went to the kitchen to drink water around 2 in the morning. As soon as I turned on the flashlight, I saw through the window, in the distance, a dark figure near that stone construction. It looked like a crouched shadow, possibly messing with something on the ground. I didn't have the courage to go out and check. I stood still, stagnant, until I lost sight of whatever was there. I returned to the living room and locked myself in. I thought about my great uncle Vincent. Was this the creature he described in his notebooks, or a group of people with whom he had contact? I wouldn't find out. The next day I finalized everything, loaded my bags, and left the property without looking back. I took a bus early in the afternoon and went straight to a small hotel in the county center. I slept there but continued to be disturbed. It was as if I could still hear noises. About 10 days later, when I had already signed the paperwork and received part of the money, the new owner called me wanting to know about missing documents. During the conversation, he made a point of commenting, "You left some weird notebooks here. I don't know if they were from the previous owner or yours, but one of them describes things that look like rituals. Do you want me to send them?" I tried to cut off the subject. I said he could keep everything, that it didn't interest me. He laughed a little, but then became serious. "I'll tell you, I don't know what was going on here, but last night something knocked on the door, and there were footsteps in the yard. I came prepared, but didn't see who it was. If there's something you need to tell me, speak up now." I denied knowing details and said goodbye. Since then, I've had no more contact. I moved to another city and sought to resume life. Even today, I have recurring nightmares. Sometimes I dream of strange-shaped footprints and noises that sound like muffled howls. Deep down, I think I'll never be sure of what really lived on that property, or how Vincent got involved with it. I only know that even far away, I still feel a kind of weight in my memory, as if part of me hadn't been freed. To this day, I don't consider returning. Everything I experienced there was real enough to make me understand that some inheritances are much heavier than anyone can bear. Good evening. My name is Marcus, and for many years I worked as a night watchman at a small antique shop nestled in the heart of New Orleans. The shop, called Eternal Memories, was renowned for its peculiar collection of vintage items, among them an impressive assortment of retro mannequins. I always considered mannequins as nothing more than plastic sculptures. However, on one specific night in the autumn of 1997, that perspective changed completely. In the beginning, my nights at work were quite peaceful. The shop remained closed and shrouded in shadow, with my only company being the antique objects, clothes, paintings, vases, and of course, the ever-silent mannequins positioned throughout the shelves and main salon. Some wore clothes, while others were displayed bare. Initially, I even enjoyed the solitude and serenity that the late hours provided. But this tranquility was interrupted after the arrival of a new shipment of merchandise. One night upon arriving for my shift, I was greeted by Leonard, the shop owner, who wore his characteristically animated smile, a clear sign that he had something new to show me. He pointed to a large crate in the center of the salon and enthusiastically told me he had received some very old mannequins that would certainly attract customers. As soon as I looked at the crate, a shiver ran down my spine. The new mannequins were wrapped in transparent plastic, but their forms were already unsettling. They were faceless heads, completely smooth and without features. While unpacking them and positioning them on their pedestals, I felt something strange, an icy sensation, almost as if I was being watched. Even without eyes or expressions, the mannequins seemed to follow my every movement. Although uncomfortable, I did my best to ignore the feeling and continued with my tasks. The first hours of the night passed without major incidents. I checked the door locks, inspected the security system, and ensured everything was in order. However, those featureless mannequins seemed to project their presence throughout the space. When the clock struck 3:21 in the morning, something truly frightening happened. At first, I heard low noises, similar to muffled whispers. I thought it was my imagination or some sound coming from outside. But gradually, the sounds became clearer and more disturbing, almost like voices conversing in hushed tones. Against what my instinct screamed, I decided to investigate. With hesitant steps, I approached the mannequins, trying to identify the source of the noises. My hands trembled as I advanced. That's when I realized something was out of place. Some mannequins were no longer in their original positions. One that had been standing upright now leaned slightly, as if trying to reach for something. Another seemed to have turned its head at a subtly different angle. The environment was filled with whispers, unintelligible words that seemed to come from the mannequins themselves. It was as if they were communicating in a language impossible to comprehend. I felt trapped in a nightmare. Fear constricted my chest as I tried to understand what was happening. Despite knowing these objects were inanimate, what I was witnessing defied all logic. Mannequins shouldn't talk, much less move. But that early morning, reality seemed to have bent to accommodate the inexplicable. Suddenly, I heard a sound that resembled a sigh coming from one of the mannequins. It was as if it were breathing. I stood frozen with terror as I watched its shoulders rise and fall in a disturbing rhythm. It made no sense. It was impossible for this to be happening. Then, to my utter horror, one of the mannequins took a small step in my direction. The movement, though discreet, was enough to make my heart race. Instinctively, I backed away, but I couldn't take my eyes off that empty face that seemed to be staring at me. The terror I felt made me run to the security post, seeking a sense of safety. At least that's what I hoped to find there. I sat in front of the camera screens, trying to calm myself. although my hands were still shaking and my breathing remained irregular. I looked intently at the monitors, hoping for some sign that what I had witnessed was real. But in the images, the mannequins were exactly where Leonard and I had left them. Simple, immobile figures surrounded by darkness. Still, the atmosphere in the shop was suffocating. I couldn't look away from the cameras, anxiously waiting for any movement, but the screens showed only silence and immobility. I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself, and stood up, feeling my legs still heavy with fear. I walked toward the door, casting cautious glances at the mannequins, while muttering to myself that it was all just a trick of my mind. When I was about to touch the doorknob, a loud creak echoed through the shop. I immediately turned my face toward the sound and saw one of the mannequins collapse to the floor, producing a dry, loud noise. I felt a chill run through my body and remained motionless, overcome with shock. There was no one in the shop besides me, and yet the mannequin had fallen on its own. I decided to face the situation. I approached with slow steps, my heart racing, and picked up the fallen mannequin. It was ice cold to the touch, as if it had just been removed from a freezer. I put it back on its pedestal, but what I saw next increased my discomfort even more. The mannequins were not only in different positions, but they also appeared more lifelike. Despite remaining faceless, their bodies showed a strange resemblance to reality. There were outlines of veins and muscles beneath the pale, smooth surface. I tried to find a logical explanation for all of this. Perhaps fatigue was affecting my perception, or maybe Leonard had rearranged the mannequins before leaving, and I simply hadn't noticed. After all, he had been near them while we unloaded the new merchandise. With these thoughts, I returned to the security post. There I fixed my attention on the cameras again, determined to find some proof that what I had experienced wasn't a product of my imagination. Minutes passed, then hours, and nothing moved on the screens. The mannequins remained still, static in their places. The clock advanced in an excruciating manner, marking each second. I felt trapped in a cycle of uncertainty and fear, questioning whether everything I had experienced was real or merely a manifestation of my mental state. Finally, after a long internal battle, I decided to face the facts. Perhaps the mannequins had never really moved, and it was all just an illusion caused by fatigue. I couldn't share my experience with anyone. I feared they would judge me incapable of handling the job. The following night, I returned to my post determined to believe that the previous episode had been the result of mental exhaustion. Still, a persistent uneasiness haunted me. From time to time, my eyes fell on the security camera images showing the mannequins. Part of me wanted them to move, even if just a little, to confirm what I had seen. But every time I observed them, I felt a growing fear that at some point they would turn directly toward the lens. My mind oscillated between the rational and the inexplicable, struggling to find some balance as the hours passed. Fatigue began to weigh on me. The experience from the previous night had deprived me of rest during the day, and now I was fighting against sleep. My eyes could barely stay fixed on the screens. Then, as if in a cruel repetition, the clock marked 3:21 once again, that fateful hour. A chill ran through my body as I, unable to avoid it, fixed my gaze on the camera pointing at the mannequins. That's when the whispers started again. They were as soft as they were disturbing, filling the shop with a strange, somber sound. The incomprehensible words had something supernatural about them, as if the mannequins were sharing obscure secrets among themselves. Fear settled in me, and my heart accelerated when I noticed something terrible. One of the mannequins was no longer in place. My lungs seemed unable to absorb air, as the reality of that absence hit me. Seeing a mannequin disappear was somehow more frightening than seeing it move. What made it all even more disturbing was that the other mannequins seemed to have turned their heads, now facing the camera. Despite their smooth faces, it was as if they were looking directly at me. That vision was surreal and deeply terrifying. Driven by pure survival instinct, I began to frantically switch between cameras, trying to locate the missing mannequin. I reviewed each image several times, but there was no sign of it. It was as if it had completely vanished. On the fourth attempt, something caught my attention. In the corner of one of the screens, I glimpsed a humanoid figure that quickly disappeared behind a group of hanging dresses. It was an indistinct shadow, but sufficient to make me believe I wasn't alone in the shop. My mind raced, exploring every possibility. It could be an intruder, someone who had managed to enter undetected and was playing with me, perhaps even responsible for the missing mannequin. The idea was frightening, but it also gave me courage to act. If there was indeed someone there, it was my duty to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight that was on the table and, with hesitant steps, walked toward the corner where I had seen that shadow. The silence inside the shop was suffocating, broken only by my accelerated breathing. Each step I took made the wooden floor creak, amplifying the sensation that something or someone might be watching me. When I finally reached the corner, the flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating piles of antique dresses and clothes that belonged to the mannequins. However, there was no sign of any intruder or the mannequin that had disappeared. I stood there, feeling a mixture of confusion and dread. Had it just been my mind playing tricks? Perhaps exhaustion and fear were distorting reality, creating images that never existed. I stood there, paralyzed, afraid to approach the spot where the other mannequins were. It was as if my own mind was conspiring to keep me away. After a long moment struggling against my paralysis, I decided to explore other parts of the shop. I searched every remaining corner, trying to find some sign that I wasn't alone, but nothing appeared. I wasn't sure if I should feel relieved by the apparent absence of an intruder, or even more disturbed by the mystery surrounding the mannequin's disappearance. Finally, I returned to my security post, wishing only for that night to end. However, as I walked back, passing by the place where I had seen the humanoid shadow, I heard something that made my heart race. It was a low whisper, almost imperceptible, but clear enough to chill my blood. The feeling that someone was trying to get my attention was unmistakable. I quickly turned around, pointing the flashlight toward a nearby mannequin. It remained motionless in a typical pose, exactly as one would expect from a mannequin. For a brief moment, I felt relief. Perhaps it was all a product of my imagination. Perhaps nothing was really happening. But this thought didn't last long. Crushed by the oppressive darkness and the persistent whispers that seemed to echo in my mind. For some reason that I still don't understand to this day, I decided to approach that mannequin. As I got closer, I noticed something even more disturbing. its appearance had changed. There was something new in the texture of its faceless skin. Beneath the smooth surface, the contours of veins and muscles were now visible, as if that inanimate object was beginning to acquire traits of a living being. My breathing became irregular as I approached. When I finally got close enough, I saw something that made me freeze. The mannequin's chest seemed to be moving, rising and falling in a grotesque replica of human breathing. Hesitantly, I extended my trembling hand to touch it, trying to find some trace of logic in it all. As soon as my fingers touched its shoulder, a cutting cold shot through my body. Its surface was cold and moist, reminiscent of the dead skin of a corpse. It was at that moment that the impossible happened. The mannequin's head slowly turned until it was facing me directly. Horror took over my mind as the mannequin began to move its arms, first one, then the other. Its movements were strange, rigid, almost as if it were fighting against some invisible force that kept it trapped. I stumbled backward, my heart racing and my mind immersed in a chaos of terror. Each step back seemed to invite the mannequin to advance, its movements defying any notion of reality. It was as if it were moved by something beyond logic, and that only intensified my panic. Not sure exactly how, my legs carried me running to the security post. As soon as I entered, I locked the door with a quick, desperate movement. My eyes sought the security cameras, looking for answers. But the screens were full of interference, static, and flashes of light, leaving me completely blind to what was happening out there. As I tried to regulate my breathing and understand what had just happened, the sound of knocking began at the post door. They were strong, insistent knocks, as if someone or something was trying to get in. With each blow, the panic intensified. The door shook under the force of the attempts, and I knew it wasn't something human on the other side. The knocking became more frantic, almost crazed, while the familiar whispers returned to echo, incomprehensible words uttered in a low, disturbing tone penetrating the wood of the door like a somber chorus. I felt paralyzed, but my survival instinct forced me to act. My trembling hands grabbed a flashlight and a piece of metal that were on the table, the only things I could use as defense. I tried to look at the cameras once more, but the images remained unusable. I was alone in a bubble of fear, trapped in a small space, surrounded by an invisible enemy. The incessant sound of the door being pounded, and the murmurs only increased my feeling of powerlessness. The hours seemed to drag on at an unbearable rate. The clock advanced slowly, marking each second like a sentence, while the siege at the door continued. Finally, the sound ceased. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the knocking. I didn't dare make any movement. I remained motionless and in complete silence, trapped in the security post with the interference on the cameras preventing any idea of what was happening out there. It was as if I were isolated in a bubble of darkness and fear, not knowing if what was outside had left or was just patiently waiting. With the arrival of morning, I heard a voice that seemed both distant and familiar. Leonard, my boss, was calling me from outside. As much as I knew it was him, terror still kept me trapped, unable to open the door. Finally, he brought a key holder to force it open, since I remained paralyzed, without the courage to move or even respond. When they finally managed to unlock the door and investigate the shop, they found nothing out of place. The mannequins were exactly where they should be, motionless in their usual poses. They seemed to mock me, as if they knew the terror they had caused. The apparent normality of the scene only made everything even more disturbing. After that night, I couldn't continue with the job. The idea of returning to that place was unbearable. I turned in my resignation, aware that I would never have peace if I had to face again the shadows, the whispers, and the faceless mannequins that had indelibly marked my mind. I tried to move on, but the memories of that experience haunt me constantly. They appear in nightmares and emerge at the most unexpected moments, hidden in the darkest corners of my mind. I know that what I experienced was real, but I also know that few believe my story. Despite everything, that shop remains in my memory as a place shrouded in mystery and horror. I will never set foot there again. It's a space that I will forever keep as a nightmare I would prefer to forget, but that refuses to disappear. I've never been one to tell stories about the supernatural. I've always maintained a skeptical stance, perhaps because nothing of that nature had ever crossed my path. To me, such tales were nothing more than fables invented to frighten others or attract attention. But what I experienced deserves to be told. I don't know if something similar has happened in other places, but in my small town in northern Maine, it undoubtedly left its mark. Loneliness can lead us to extremes, and relentless evil knows how to take advantage of this. During that period, I lived with my wife and my older sister. It was common for her to come and stay with us whenever she had disagreements with her partner or discovered some infidelity. My wife and I had grown accustomed to her unexpected arrivals, carrying suitcases and bags at all hours. Since our town was small, word spread quickly, and the neighbors knew every detail, but our parents taught us to ignore worthless gossip. I taught physics at the local high school, which meant I knew practically everyone: parents, mothers, and students. I always had a good relationship with all of them, even with the most challenging students. I made it a point to find ways for them to understand the material and apply it effectively in their exams. Parents trusted me, and my colleagues respected me. I had nothing to complain about. My life was good and peaceful, and I was immensely grateful for it. At that time, my wife and I weren't planning on having children yet. We agreed that we could wait a little longer before expanding the family. My sister, however, insisted that it was time for us to start, so we wouldn't face the challenges of parenthood when we were older. She said this easily, perhaps because she didn't take care of her own children. Her two little ones lived with their paternal grandmother. I always reprimanded her, saying that children should accompany their mother wherever she went. But she argued that she didn't want to drag them into the conflicts she had with her partner. My wife took care of the house. We came from a community where it was common for the man to be responsible for providing and the woman for the home. At that time, it didn't seem strange. Almost all families followed this model, although often husbands were unfaithful, and wives conformed out of fear of being rejected by society, especially if they had children. My sister was one of the few who didn't accept this silent rule. We had a neighbor whom I consider the central character of this story. His name was Vincent, a kind-hearted man. Everyone in the community knew him. His father, now deceased, had been the town's mayor, and his mother was a hard-working councilwoman who had achieved much through her own merit. Despite their effort and resilience, cancer took both of them, leaving Vincent as the heir to a remarkable legacy. From time to time on weekends, I would go out drinking and end up returning home late at night, with alcohol still dominating my senses. It wasn't a habit, but I did it when I felt the need for a moment of liberation. My wife understood and never criticized me for these escapades, as she knew that in return, I did everything possible to meet all her needs. I earned well, and we both enjoyed the fruits of my labor together. But one night changed everything. Returning home after drinking too much, my steps were uncertain, and my vision oscillated between blurry and clear. Even so, I pressed on, determined to reach home. I was almost there when I passed by Vincent's house. The living room light was on, and this caught my attention for a few seconds, distraction enough to make me trip and fall. As I stood up, I looked again at the window and saw something that left me paralyzed. The silhouette of a man. It didn't appear to be Vincent, judging by the haircut. It was someone different. I was ready to ignore it and continue on my way until something incredible happened. Horns began to emerge from the man's head. The scene was surreal, like a nightmare lived while awake. My state of intoxication disappeared instantly, and overcome with terror, I ran home without hesitation. Upon entering, I slammed the door with such force that I woke my wife and sister. They came running, alarmed, and found me huddled on the sofa, trembling and sweating cold, the pallor on my face betraying the terror that dominated me. They thought I had been attacked on the street, or worse, that I was under the influence of some illicit substance. I vehemently denied this while trying to calm myself. My breathing was short, and my heart felt like it was about to explode. With great difficulty, they managed to give me water with sugar so I could regain control. Only after half an hour could I say something. I explained what I had seen in the neighbor's window, but their expressions of doubt left me frustrated. It was clear they thought my mind, or the alcohol, was playing tricks on me. I shouted that it was real, that I wasn't imagining things. My wife, in an effort to calm me, led me to the bedroom, where I finally fell asleep. However, the next morning, the vision still tormented me. While my wife and sister hoped I would forget the incident, it seemed impossible to erase from my memory. I spent a good part of the day observing Vincent's house from the window. That's when I noticed something strange. There were two figures in the living room. Vincent had always lived alone. His wife had died from an illness, and his brother had lost his life in a traffic accident in the city. It was a mystery who this visitor could be. But my wife clarified that 2 days earlier, a man had begun to frequent Vincent's house, and apparently would be staying there as a guest. This confirmed my suspicions that the horned individual was the newcomer, but my wife remained skeptical. My curiosity almost led me to go to the neighbor's house to confront him, but I thought it better not to act rashly. After all, I didn't know who or what that man really was. I decided to keep calm and try to understand the situation. However, before I could devise a plan, Vincent appeared at my house with a friendly smile. He said he wanted to invite me to the bar, where I usually drank, to play a game of poker with him. He introduced his new friend, Damien. I found the similarity between their names intriguing, but somehow that meeting gave me the opportunity to approach, without raising suspicions. About an hour later, I met the new friend of my neighbor. He appeared much younger than us. While I was already 32 years old, and Vincent was close to 40, Damien appeared to be at most 25. Despite the age difference, we went out that night, and to my surprise, the fun was greater than I had expected. Damien had an impressive skill with table games. I considered myself good, but he was simply unbeatable. Not even luck favored me against him. I ended up losing a good amount of money, and Vincent tried to ease the situation, joking that at least I had gained a new friend. Honestly, I saw no possibility of considering that young man as a friend. Something about him didn't inspire confidence. It was a feeling I couldn't ignore. And when I had this type of intuition about someone, I always stayed alert. The days that followed were somewhat confusing, and the jokes from my wife and sister didn't help. They loved to mock the vision I had of horns coming out of Damien's head. Sometimes this deeply irritated me, but I had to admit they were good with humor, even if it was at my expense. Damien, on the other hand, did everything to appear likable. However, the more he tried, the more my suspicions grew. It was as if a part of me was always on alert when he was around, like an instinct warning me of something unusual. I couldn't explain why, but I couldn't simply ignore this feeling. Then something curious happened at school. Perhaps out of carelessness, but without realizing it, I wrote the name Damien in the corner of the blackboard. One of the students noticed, and instead of asking me to erase it, approached with an air of curiosity. He said he knew the origin of that name, and that it had caught his attention. Of course, I was intrigued and asked what he knew. He explained that Damien was a name associated with a celestial angel, but that it was also often confused as an alternative title for Lucifer, popularly known as the devil. Immediately, the image of the horns I saw on my neighbor's friend's head returned with full force. It couldn't be a coincidence. The description matched perfectly with what I had witnessed that night. I disguised my interest, commenting that it was interesting information, and that I admired the fact that he enjoyed reading about religious subjects. Upon returning home, I felt restless. The thought that Damien might be something beyond a skillful young man, perhaps even a malevolent figure in disguise, began to take shape in my mind. Was he there to cause some kind of harm to my neighbor, or worse? I tried to push these ideas away, convincing myself that I was exaggerating. I needed to clear my head and stop feeding theories that only made me more nervous. The following weekend, Vincent and Damien again invited me to go out. This time the idea was to drink a bit and play dominoes. After the beating at poker, I imagined I might have more luck with another game. My wife and sister laughed at the situation. For them, it was ironic that I was so suspicious of the young man, and yet continued to go out with him. I admit they were right, it was contradictory. But at the same time, I felt an almost uncontrollable need to stay close. Perhaps it was the only way to discover what was behind that boy who, each day, seemed more mysterious. Curiously, that night seemed to promise only fun, but things took an unexpected turn. We sat, played, and drank as usual. A few hours later, already somewhat altered by alcohol, we decided to go to the bathroom. It was at this moment that Damien ended up bumping into a tall, robust man who lived right across from my house. I tried to ease the situation, but the atmosphere quickly heated up. The neighbor seemed determined to go after Damien, ready to start a fight. Then Damien, with an almost disturbing calmness, simply pointed his finger at him and said that he should be prepared. The phrase was direct, but loaded with something difficult to explain. The environment, previously noisy, fell into complete silence. Everyone in the place heard it, and the man, without saying another word, took his beer and left the bar without even looking back. That wasn't normal. The scene seemed like a simple threat, but there was something in Damien's look, too serene for someone in that situation, and under the effect of alcohol, that betrayed that something bigger was at play. I was on alert. I felt this story wasn't over yet. The next day, my focus was entirely on the neighbor's house, whom Damien had confronted. Everything seemed calm, at least until rumors began to circulate. They said he was claiming to have seen and heard strange things during the night. More than that, he was certain his life was in danger. I hadn't heard anything, as I was probably asleep, but I decided to confirm with my wife and sister. Both reported that it was true. He had screamed during the early hours. They also said there had been an intense discussion with his family members, who threatened to commit him if he continued to shout absurdities. This caught my attention. It was rare to hear this type of comment in town, and everything pointed in the same direction. Damien's threat had not been empty words. Convinced there was a connection, I decided to face the mystery head-on and went to the neighbor's house. His brother answered the door with an expression of fatigue mixed with disappointment. He wanted to know what I needed, clearly worn out by the situation. From inside, it was possible to hear the neighbor, David, speaking loudly, arguing with his wife or some other family member. I explained to his brother that I wanted to talk to David and that I was willing to help with anything. Reluctantly, they accepted, and so I managed to sit with the man who was now the most talked about person in town. I began by asking about the things he claimed to have seen and heard during the night. David realized I wasn't there to doubt him, and this encouraged him to speak. He recounted that everything happened in a single night, but it was enough to shake his beliefs. He said he saw figures dressed in white scattered throughout the house, motionless like statues, blocking the way. Some of these figures spoke, stating that he would be condemned to hell for having messed with whom he shouldn't have. As he related this, it became clear that David made no connection between these visions and the encounter he had with Damien at the bar. For me, however, there was no doubt. The two events were connected. Still, I had no way to prove anything. I just felt with all conviction that Damien was at the center of it all. I continued following David's story, and he revealed to me in a moment of desperation that if he went through another night like that, he would do something drastic to end the torment. He begged that God forgive him in advance. I did what I could to calm him, but nothing seemed to have any effect. I left there with the information he shared, but deep down, I didn't know how it could help. The next day, upon returning from school, I heard that David had had another episode during the night. The family had to do the impossible to calm him. In the morning, he had run through the streets screaming that he was pursuing him, tormenting him with entities that clung to his house. The details were so vivid and specific that it didn't seem to be an invention. People commented that David had never been like this, Something serious must have happened, and I felt I needed to help him somehow. However, time escaped me. On the third day after that fateful encounter, David was found dead in his room, victim of a cardiac arrest. The cause was never clarified, but in town, people murmured that the devil had taken him, exactly as he feared. The news was a shock. I hadn't expected him to actually die, but this confirmed he had been right all along, and the person responsible for everything was Damien. I decided to alert Vincent about who his friend really was. However, as I approached his house, I saw the two arguing at the door. I couldn't understand the reason, but the shouting made it clear they were in profound disagreement. Neighbors observed as I advanced slowly. That's when Damien, with the same calm and disturbing tone as always, ended the fight by pointing his finger at Vincent and saying he would have more fun with him than with the others. The words left me confused, but then he simply walked away, disappearing into the darkness. That was the last time I saw him. I supported Vincent as best I could and accompanied him to his house, where he invited me in. We sat, had a drink, and began to talk. He didn't reveal the details of the argument, but said David's life was over, that there was no more salvation, and that he hoped God would have mercy on his soul. I asked him to be clearer, to stop speaking in riddles. It was then that he admitted Damien was the devil himself. I immediately remembered what my student had told me about the name at school. I was stunned but believed him. I asked how he had become so intimately involved with Damien. He explained that after the death of his wife and brother, he felt completely alone. Driven by despair, he decided to summon Damien to be his company in the days he had left. At that moment, I thought this had been the worst possible decision, as desperate as it was foolish and dangerous. Looking at the pain he carried, I could understand him. He didn't want to die alone, that was all. However, Vincent soon asked me to leave. He said he didn't want to be saved, that he feared death, but that there was nothing more that could be done. I left with tears streaming down my face, certain that this good man was condemned. I decided I would seek a priest the next day to try to find some form of help, but I didn't have time. At midnight, Vincent's screams broke the silence of the night. It was an anguished sound, loaded with suffering. He called out to God, begging for his soul to be taken, and that he be spared the terrible fate he feared, hell. The intensity of those pleas made me act immediately. I ran to his house, broke down the door without hesitation, and entered. The neighbors, also alerted by the screams, left their houses. Some saw me break in and decided to follow me. But when we reached the last room, it was already too late. In the red-walled bedroom, a tone that in the light of the moment didn't seem to come from paint, we found Vincent's remains. The state he was in is something I will never be able to describe or forget. He had died, but no one could explain how. Since that night, the house remains empty. The doors are locked, and no one dares to enter, nor have there been any interested buyers, which, in my opinion, is the most sensible decision. Something dark and inexplicable presence seems to have remained there, roaming the walls and lurking for those who dare to approach. I carry what happened as a weight in my heart. As much as time passes, the lament for Vincent's fate will accompany me forever. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.